When civil war erupted in Scotland in 1639, King Charles placed great importance on securing his loyalty. From his camp at Berwick, the king wrote directly to him, promising extensive lands that would be forfeited by his political enemies if he continued to support the royal cause. The king assured him that these promises would be confirmed formally, provided he used his influence and resources in defense of the crown. During this period, he supplied valuable intelligence about Covenanter plans in the north and played a key role in negotiations aimed at bringing Irish MacDonald forces into Scotland on the king's behalf. Although preparations were underway, he died before he could take the field. He had married Janet Mackenzie of Kintail, and together they had several children, including Sir James, who would succeed him. Other sons went on to distinguish themselves in later conflicts, while his daughters formed alliances with powerful Highland families through marriage. He died in October 1643, leaving his eldest son to inherit his titles and responsibilities. Sir James MacDonald became the 9th Baron and 2nd Baronet of Sleat in 1644. He quickly aligned himself with the royalist cause and joined the Marquis of Montrose. His men fought at Inverlochie and later supported Charles II during the invasion of England in 1651, with many participating in the Battle of Worcester. During the campaigns of 1646, Sir James was among those who retreated with Montrose through the Highlands after royal orders forced Montrose to disband his army. Despite these setbacks, Sir James remained an influential figure in the north. He later withdrew to Skye, where he lived cautiously during the turbulent years that followed. He was widely respected for his intelligence, discipline, and leadership, and his followers trusted him deeply. One of his most significant actions was his role in bringing the murderers of Alexander MacDonald of Keppoch to justice. When legal measures failed, authority was granted for direct action. The operation was carried out swiftly and decisively, restoring order and earning official praise from the government. His efforts were widely seen as a turning point in reducing lawlessness in the Highlands. Despite his loyalty, Sir James was heavily fined after the Restoration, largely due to political rivalries. Even so, he maintained his status as a prominent Highland gentleman. At home, his residence was known as a place of music, hospitality, and culture. Poets described candlelit halls, fine company, and generous feasting, while also praising his bravery and presence in battle. He married Margaret Mackenzie of Coygeek and later Mary MacLeod of Harris, fathering several children who would continue the Sleat line. He also had a natural son, Archibald, a respected warrior and Gaelic poet who played a key role in enforcing justice during troubled times. Sir James died in December 1678. Sir Donald MacDonald, 10th Baron and 3rd Baronet of Sleat, supported Viscount Dundee during the Jacobite Rising, but fell seriously ill and returned home. His eldest son took command in his place and fought at Killiecrankie in 1689, where many members of the clan lost their lives. Despite heavy losses, the surviving MacDonalds returned to the Isles. Sir Donald continued to support the Jacobite cause during the following years. His territories were attacked by government forces, and his residence was burned, though the attackers were soon driven off. Eventually, peace negotiations led to temporary settlements with the new government, though later betrayals and events such as Glencoe revealed how fragile these agreements truly were. Sir Donald died in 1695 and was succeeded by his son. The next Sir Donald MacDonald, known as Donald of the Wars, became 11th Baron of Sleat. He attended the Jacobite gathering at Brymer, but was soon arrested and imprisoned by the government. Despite this, He later reappeared in the north at the head of hundreds of followers. Together with the Earl of Seaforth, he helped assemble a powerful Jacobite force that successfully routed government troops at Alness. The Jacobite army then marched south, joining the Earl of Mar. Along the way, they avoided unnecessary destruction and treated neutral clans with restraint. Although the campaign ultimately failed, the retreat was carried out in scattered groups, preventing total destruction of the Highland forces. Loyalty to traditional chiefs remained strong, even as political realities forced the rebellion to collapse. As soon as the big wave of new fighters reached Perth, the Earl of Mar decided it was time to move fast. His plan was to cross the River Forth and confront Argyll, who was leading the government army. Reports from the time say Mar now had the support of Seaforth, Sir Donald MacDonald, and other clan leaders, bringing his total strength to around 8,000 men. On the 12th of November, the Jacobite army began preparing to march out of Perth, aiming to link up with allies near Auchterarder and then force a crossing of the Forth. Argyll quickly learned what was happening. He immediately ordered field guns to be brought from Edinburgh, and he also made sure every reinforcement expected from Ireland had arrived. Then he chose a bold approach. Rather than letting Mar reach the banks of the Forth, he would strike first and fight wherever he could catch him. Argyll crossed the Forth at Stirling Bridge with his full army and advanced toward Dunblane, setting the stage for a major clash. The two forces finally met on Sunday, the 13th of November, near a place remembered as Sheriff Muir, close to Dunblane. The battle itself became one of the most famous moments of the Rising. In the fiercest part of the fighting, the MacDonalds showed the old reputation of their name. One eyewitness account from the Jacobite side explains that when the enemy first came into view, Mar ordered a cavalry commander to push forward with his own troops and a MacDonald battalion under Sir Donald's banner, climbing the higher ground to drive the government line back. For a moment, the opposing force fell away from sight, as if pushed off the ridge. Later, the right side of Mar's army, made up largely of clans, surged forward under the leadership of Sir Donald's brothers James and William, alongside Glengarry, Clanranald, Sir John Maclean, Glencoe, and others. Their attack hit with shocking speed. Within minutes, the government troops directly in front of them broke apart so badly that it was hard to tell where their units even were. The Highland charge pushed the enemy's main body back for roughly half a mile, cutting them down where they could and taking prisoners as they ran. The same sources also tried to measure the power of each clan by estimating how many men each chief could raise. In those lists, Sir Donald MacDonald is often placed among the strongest, with about 1,000 men. Clanranald is usually given a similar number, while Glengarry is described as fearless and assigned around 500. Keppoch is described with fewer men, yet still on the Jacobite side. Some writers speak harshly of certain groups, accusing them of discipline problems, but even critics had to admit the Highland rush could smash a line when it landed cleanly. Even historians who disliked the Highlanders were forced to acknowledge what happened on that right wing. The charge was so violent that it drove government troops and cavalry down the slope toward Dunblane with heavy losses. Another experienced soldier described the pattern of attack in a way that shows how these fighters worked. The clans advanced fast, firing scattered shots as they moved, then dropped flat when the enemy fired a full volley. The moment the firing slowed, they sprang up, tossed aside their muskets, drew swords, and stormed through the line with incredible speed. According to that description, in only a few minutes, the government troops in their path turned and ran, retreating almost 2 miles before they finally slowed down. Yet, as winter dragged on, morale collapsed at the top. By the end of January, it became clear that neither the Chevalier nor Mar truly wanted another major battle, even though many Highlanders were desperate to fight again. The anger in the camp grew so strong that ordinary clansmen openly accused the leadership of betrayal. One Highland voice from that moment captured the mood in blunt words. They had not taken up arms just to flee, and they would rather die fighting than be hunted down without resistance. Sir Donald saw the situation for what it was. He believed Mar and the Chevalier would never risk another full confrontation, so he left them and withdrew with roughly 1,000 strong warriors back to Skye. He held out there for a time, but eventually government troops were sent against him under an officer named Colonel Clayton. Sir Donald avoided open battle. Still without a firm promise of safety, he chose to slip away from danger. He crossed to Uist. Afterward, the government formally condemned him for his role in the uprising. Like many Highland leaders of that period, his lands were seized by the crown. He had married Mary from the MacDonald family of Castletown, and they had children, including a son named Donald, who became the family's main heir. His daughters also married into other families, creating ties that reached into both the Isles and mainland Scotland. Sir Donald died in 1718, struck by paralysis, and his son Donald was regarded as the next representative of the line, even though he never truly regained the lost estates. He was remembered as the last of the family said to be born in the old stronghold at Duntulm, and people spoke of him as a kind and promising young man, admired by both kin and clan. In 1720, during a visit to friends on Bernera, tragedy struck suddenly. Shortly after arriving, he died from a burst blood vessel. He was still unmarried, and his early death brought deep grief across the community. With no direct heir, the family representation passed to his uncle, Sir James of Oronsay. Sir James became the next Baron and Baronet of Sleat. He married Janet MacLeod of Grishernich and had children, including Alexander, who would later succeed. After Janet's death, Sir James remarried into the Castletown branch of the MacDonalds. He died at Forres in 1723, and his eldest son, Sir Alexander, took his place. At this stage, the family's lands were still burdened by the consequences of forfeiture and debt. A close friend of the Sleat House, Kenneth Mackenzie, an advocate based in Edinburgh, stepped in and bought the estates on behalf of the family through the official process used for confiscated properties. To protect the lands from being lost again, legal arrangements were created so the property could be secured for Sir Alexander and the future line, while placing limits on how it could be broken apart or sold. Island tradition in Skye tells the story in a more dramatic way. People remembered a harsh government factor managing Troturnich during the forfeiture years, a man widely hated for cruelty. At the same time, many influential figures worked behind the scenes to keep the MacDonalds from becoming permanent enemies of the state. The common local version says the property was restored indirectly, passing through trusted hands, before being returned to the rightful heir. In that story, William, known as the Tutor, received control first, and then handed it over immediately to the true head of the family, keeping only a modest lifetime holding and a symbolic lease for his descendants. Local memory also preserved the Tutor's reputation as a strong, respected man with a gentle nature, connected through marriage into a powerful network of Highland families. When he died, Skye tradition describes his funeral as one of the greatest the island had ever seen, with an enormous procession, multiple pipers, and a massive gathering from Skye and nearby isles. Sir Alexander later stayed out of the 1745 Rising, largely from caution, even though sympathy for the Jacobite cause was strong in the Isles. It is said that he and MacLeod of Dunvegan had once hinted they would support Prince Charles if a French army arrived, but in the real crisis, they leaned towards the government. A letter from that summer shows how carefully some chiefs spoke. It describes neighboring clans joining the prince, expresses alarm, and asks for guidance, while insisting that Skye would not openly tie itself to what they called reckless action. After Culloden, Sir Alexander visited Fort Augustus to meet the Duke of Cumberland. When the Duke joked about him as a rebel, Sir Alexander answered sharply that if he truly had been the rebel of the Isles, the Duke would never have marched safely across the Spoy. In Skye, Sir Alexander was well liked, partly because he lived among his people and held strong personal influence. His wife, Lady Margaret, was also celebrated for beauty and warmth, and stories describe islanders treating her with deep respect, even clearing stones from roads so her horse would not stumble. Even when the government demanded men from Skye, it was difficult to persuade locals to fight against Prince Charles. Many who were raised were not told clearly who they would be fighting for, and when they reached Inverness, they were shocked to learn they were expected to support the government against the prince and against other Highlanders. In practice, far fewer men showed up than officials claimed could be raised. Only 2 companies of MacDonalds arrived at Inverness at the end of December, led by close relatives of Sir Alexander. Sir Alexander died young in 1746 while traveling, and his son, Sir James, inherited as a child. A trusted figure known as Kingsburgh became tutor and guardian, handling the family's affairs carefully until Sir James came of age. Years later, Sir James rewarded that long service with a yearly pension. In 1764, Sir James was injured during a hunting trip in North Uist when a companion's gun discharged by accident. He was carried across the moor to Valley House, where he recovered slowly. The shock of the incident was so intense that locals briefly feared betrayal and gathered in anger. But they were calmed when trusted figures swore it had been a pure accident. The event became part of island memory, inspiring famous music and ceremonial pieces associated with the MacDonald name. Sir James grew into a remarkable young man, known for learning, discipline, and an unusually mature understanding of the world. He was praised as both a scholar and someone with real plans for improving life in the Isles. Because of fragile health, he traveled to warmer climates and went to Italy in 1765. He met leading intellectuals, reached Rome, and after a long illness died there in July 1766, only 25 years old. His death caused widespread admiration and sorrow far beyond Scotland. In Rome, extraordinary public honors were given at his funeral, despite religious differences, and his name was praised by scholars and writers at home and abroad. Back in Sleat, a monument was raised in his memory, describing his rare mixture of knowledge, good character, and promise. Among the Gaels, elegies were composed for him, keeping his reputation alive in poetry as well as history. General Stewart of Garth says Sir James's early death was a disaster for Skye. In a place that was still remote and underdeveloped, losing a leader like him meant losing a rare chance for progress. Stewart argues that Sir James's learning, personal virtue, and genuine concern for ordinary people could have brought huge long-term benefits. He also points out that many local gentleman farmers and leading tenants were unusually well educated for the time, and that Latin conversation was sometimes heard among them. Sir James had been educated at Eton, sent there while still young because he strongly wanted that path. He never married, and when he died, the family leadership passed to his next brother, Sir Alexander MacDonald. Sir Alexander became the 16th Baron and 9th Baronet of Sleat, and in July 1766, he was raised into the Irish peerage as Baron MacDonald of Sleat, with the title set to pass through his male heirs. He had already begun a military career, receiving a commission as an ensign in the Coldstream Guards. In 1768, he married Elizabeth Diana, the eldest daughter of Godfrey Bosville of Gunthwaite in Yorkshire. Their marriage settlement included financial protection for her if she outlived him, and it also set aside money for younger children to be paid when they came of age, or if their father died first. Later, he made additional provision for younger sons as well. He was deeply involved in politics and used the estate in calculated ways. Parts of the lands were granted out to close allies and trusted figures so they could meet the property requirements to vote in county elections. Not long after, these same allies transferred their holdings back to him, although the paperwork was not always completed in the strictest way. The point was clear. He was trying to build political leverage while keeping the estate effectively under family control. Lord MacDonald was known as an able and cultured man. He cared about books and historical study, and was admitted to the Society of Antiquaries. Music was another passion. He supported musicians and took real pleasure in their skill. A famous traveling harper named O'Kane was often welcomed at his house, and Lord MacDonald was said to be a strong violin player and a sharp judge of talent. During one visit, he presented O'Kane with an old and valuable harp key that had long been kept in the family, richly decorated and considered worth a very large sum. In 1777, the government issued orders for him to help raise a Highland regiment and offered him a senior command. He declined the rank for himself, but urged that it be given to Major John MacDonald of Lochgarry. Lochgarry quickly raised a strong regiment, and Lord MacDonald's influence helped fill the ranks. Years later, a dispute broke out over enlistment payments. Before it could be settled, the men asked for Lord MacDonald himself, and he advanced the money they claimed, taking the risk upon himself. To the soldiers, that was the act of a patron who would not let them be cheated. Even so, he was not universally loved. He carried the nickname the Fair-Haired Lord, but he was also seen as an English-trained chief who demanded higher rents with a hard hand. Some principal tenants tried to hold the old rents, and as pressure increased, many people chose emigration. Visitors arriving at Portree even noted a ship waiting to carry emigrants away, a quiet sign of how quickly disputes between chief and clan could end in separation. Dr. Johnson's comments, recorded in the same tradition, underline this tension. He warned that educating heirs far from their own estates could produce chiefs who did not truly know their people, had little local attachment, and eventually felt alienated from both land and tenants. Johnson suggested that a strong mind could benefit from such an education, but that many Highland chiefs would be softened into insignificance. In a famous exchange, Johnson urged Sir Alexander to think boldly, build local strength, celebrate clan loyalty, keep arms ready, while Sir Alexander raised practical objections. Johnson dismissed the excuses and insisted that a chief who wanted a strong country would find ways to make it work. By his wife, Sir Alexander had several children. The line of succession ran mainly through two sons, Alexander Wentworth and Godfrey, who later became successive Lords MacDonald. He died in 1795, and his eldest son inherited. Alexander Wentworth, the second Lord MacDonald, invested heavily in improving the estate. One of his most visible projects was the building of Armadale Castle in Sleat, a grand modern residence designed in a Gothic style. He also raised a regiment from his lands in the Isles at the end of the 18th century. The unit was gathered quickly, inspected and embodied at Inverness, and later earned a reputation for good discipline. When the regiment was eventually disbanded, the soldiers gave their officers an unusually warm farewell, treating them with real affection and respect. He died unmarried in 1824, so the title and estates passed to his brother, Godfrey, a career soldier, and the family continued through him. After this, the narrative shifts to a different branch, the MacDonalds of Balranald. Their early story is presented as a brutal struggle for land in North Uist. Donald Herak held a wide stretch of property, but his ambitious kinsman Gillespie Dubh wanted it. Gillespie lured Donald into a trap, used deception to overpower him, and had him killed in a cruel and calculated way. Gillespie then seized control, even taking custody of Donald's son, while another son escaped to Skye. What makes the tale stranger is that Gillespie kept his nephews alive and raised them under his authority, as if he intended to rule as their guardian rather than erase them completely. In the end, the nephews turned on him. During a hunting outing, a quarrel was staged, and Gillespie demanded a weapon to punish one of them. Instead, the blade was turned on him, and he was killed on the spot, ending his grip on the family lands. Revenge did not stop there. A man named Paul, who had helped in Donald Herak's murder, received land for his role, but lived in fear afterward. Donald's sons eventually hunted him down when he tried to flee to sanctuary. He was wounded as he crossed into the protected ground and was then killed. And local memory held his name in contempt for generations. The places connected to these events remained marked in tradition long afterward. From that violent beginning, the Balranald line settles into a more straightforward succession, passed from father to son across many generations. Over time, the family produces military officers and landholders, forms alliances through marriage, and expands into wider British service, including careers abroad. The story then becomes less about blood feuds and more about inheritance, service, and the steady continuation of the branch into later centuries. The Kingsburgh branch begins with James MacDonald, the second son of Donald Gruamac MacDonald, the fourth Baron of Sleat. James was the brother of Donald Gorm of Sleat, who pressed his claim to the earldom of Ross and the lordship of the Isles, and who was killed in 1539 at Islandonan Castle in Kintail during conflict with the Mackenzies. James MacDonald of Kingsburgh lived through a period of constant unrest and became a leading figure in the long-running disputes between the Sleat MacDonalds and the MacLeods during the reigns of James V and Mary. While his nephew Donald, the sixth Baron of Sleat, was still underage, James acted as his guardian and manager, and was remembered as carrying out that duty with loyalty and honor. He married a woman from the MacLeods of Harris, and their family continued through his eldest son, John, alongside another son named Donald. John MacDonald inherited next. In the late 1570s, this John, described as the heir of James MacDonald Gruamac of Castle Camus in Sleat, was held as a prisoner at Inchconnell Castle on Loch Awe. From captivity, he complained that the Earl of Argyll had detained him through harsh and unlawful methods. John was later killed around 1585 on Mull during a fierce engagement already known in local tradition. He had married into the MacDonalds of Knoydart and left an only son, Donald. Donald MacDonald, widely known in Gaelic tradition as Domnall Mac Ian Ich Shumais, stands out as the great warrior figure of this line. He was famed not only for leadership, but for extraordinary physical strength and fearlessness, and he led the MacDonalds of Skye in 3 set battles against the MacLeods and the Macleans, winning each time despite facing larger forces. He also played a central role in the wider feud between Donald Gorm More of Sleat and Rory More MacLeod of Dunvegan, a feud that turned districts into targets for raids and retaliation. When MacLeod struck into Trotternish with fire and sword, Sleat answered by sending men into Harris, killing people, and carrying off cattle. MacLeod then dispatched 40 warriors to devastate North Uist, and they even seized goods from a church precinct where the locals had placed property for safety. At that moment, Donald of Kingsburgh appeared with only 12 men. The fight was so sharp that the MacDonalds recovered the cattle and goods and killed the MacLeod leader Donald Glass and most of his raiders, leaving only a tiny handful to escape and report the disaster. Another version preserved in local memory places the raiders feasting inside the religious house at Carinish after gathering their plunder there. Donald and his 12 men attacked with bow, arrow, and sword so effectively that only 2 MacLeods survived to bring word back to their chief, whose galleys waited nearby. Donald took an arrow wound in the struggle, but recovered quickly and remained active as a fighting leader. The dead were said to have been buried near the battlefield, and the place-name tradition remembered it as a ground soaked in blood, with grim stories about skulls once displayed in church windows. Not long after, once he was well enough, Donald set out for Skye to report what happened. Crossing the Minch, a sudden snowstorm and opposing wind forced his galley away from the route, leaving him no choice but to shelter at Rodeel in Harris, one of Rory Moore's seats. The arrival was unknown to most of the household until it was noticed by Macrimmon, MacLeod's page, who came from Skye and was linked to Donald as a godson. That night, Rory Moore was feasting with his own men, uneasy as the storm worsened. Looking out into the darkness, he declared that even his worst enemy would not be refused shelter on such a night. And at that very moment, Macrimmon revealed that Donald of Kingsburgh was already outside. Rory Moore, though startled, chose the path of hospitality and ordered that Donald and his company be brought in. The 2 groups sat facing each other at a heavy table set with rich food. Tension rose as wine flowed, and MacLeod men watched the strangers with resentment. A reckless voice recalled the battle fought 3 weeks earlier at Carinish, and the words ignited the room. Daggers flashed, and a massacre might have followed if the chief had not stepped in with absolute authority, forcing his men to put away their weapons and refusing to let violence stain his guest right. When Rory later asked why Donald had drawn his sword, Donald answered that he had not come to strike first, but that if any of his men were hit, he intended to seize the greatest prize first, meaning he would strike straight at the highest-ranking target. That night, although Donald was offered better quarters, he chose to sleep with his men. Before dawn, Macrimmon returned to say a fair wind had risen for Skye. The MacDonalds launched immediately, and only after reaching open water did they look back and see the sleeping house set ablaze. MacLeod men had lit it, believing the MacDonalds were still inside. The MacDonald piper answered the treachery by playing a tune that mocked the disgrace, while the galley slipped away to Duntulm in Trotternish. In 1601, while Rory Moore was away seeking support in Argyll, Donald Gorm Moore gathered his forces and pushed into MacLeod territory to force a battle. Rory's brother Alexander MacLeod of Mingonish assembled the fighting men and made camp near Ben Chullin. The clash that followed lasted the whole day, both sides refusing to yield. the MacDonalds won, taking important MacLeod leaders prisoner and wounding many, while other prominent MacLeods fell on the field. Donald of Kingsburg fought with marked bravery in this battle as well. Soon after, government authority intervened and ordered both sides to disband and submit to great nobles until the quarrel could be settled. Through mediation by friends, the chiefs were reconciled, prisoners were returned, and open war ended, even though legal disputes continued. In the spirit of peace, Rory Moore later hosted Donald Gorm Moore at Dunvegan, where MacCrimmon welcomed the MacDonald chief with a newly composed salute. Donald of Kingsburg was also remembered in tradition as one of the first to drive Highland cattle from the Western Isles to mainland and southern markets, turning island stock into wider profit. He married into the MacDonalds of Keppoch, and the line continued through later generations. After him came Alexander MacDonald, described as a firm loyalist who joined Montrose and fought through his campaigns. Alexander was counted among a group of Sleat kinsmen killed at Killiecrankie. The next Donald MacDonald also gained military reputation, joined Dundee during the upheavals of the Revolution, and later fought at Sheriff Muir. From there, the story moves to another Alexander MacDonald of Kingsburg, remembered less for battles and more for integrity and long service as a trusted manager of the Sleat chief's affairs. This Alexander became deeply involved in the drama of 1746, when he gave shelter to the young Chevalier on Skye and helped him escape. For that, he was arrested under the Duke of Cumberland's orders and held in Edinburgh Castle for about a year before being freed under a general act of indemnity. He married Florence from the Castleton branch and left children, including Alan as heir, along with other sons and daughters whose descendants spread widely through military, professional, and public life. After Alexander's release and his continued service as tutor and advisor to the Sleat chiefs, he received an annuity in recognition of loyal work across decades. He died at an advanced age in 1772 and was succeeded by his eldest son, Alan MacDonald. Alan MacDonald married the famous Flora MacDonald in 1750. After inheriting, they lived at Kingsburg House, the same place where Prince Charles had once slept for a night while fleeing through Skye. In 1773, they hosted Dr. Johnson and Boswell. Financial strain followed, tied to earlier disruptions and to the long shadow of Jacobite involvement, and the family chose emigration to North America. In North Carolina, the American War of Independence erupted. Alan became a captain in a Highland emigrant regiment raised for the crown, and Flora stayed with the camp for a time, encouraging the men until the march began. Their sons also joined the struggle, as did a MacLeod officer who had married their eldest daughter. Alan later fell into enemy hands and was imprisoned, while Flora, under pressure and lacking resources, decided to return to Scotland, hoping Alan would follow when freed. During the voyage home, their ship was attacked by a French privateer. Flora refused to hide below deck and instead remained above, urging the crew on until the attackers were driven off. In the fight, she was knocked down and her arm was broken. Later, she would remark that she had risked her life for 2 rival causes and had gained little reward from either. Back in the Highlands, she stayed with family in Uist until peace in 1783 allowed Alan to return. They then lived again at Kingsburg, supported by his half-pay and farm income, and spent their remaining years in relative comfort. Flora died in 1790 and was buried at Kilmower in the Kingsburg vault, with strong local memory surrounding her burial and a monument later raised in her honor. Alan survived her only a short time, dying in 1795, and he was laid beside her. Their children included sons who served in ranger units, naval service, marine command, and army posts in India, as well as daughters who married into other Highland families, with descendants spreading across Britain and overseas. A separate section then turns to the MacDonalds of Castleton, another Sleat-connected branch. The first Castleton figure named is Donald MacDonald, the second son of Sir Donald MacDonald, and he was active during the civil wars of his time. He married into the Camerons of Lochiel and left a son, John, as heir, as well as a daughter, Mary, who married into other prominent MacDonald lines. John MacDonald of Castleton fought at Killiecrankie and married a woman from the Macleans of Ardgour. Their children included Donald as heir and Roderick Mac Ian of Camuscross, whose line later becomes crucial when the direct male line of Castleton ends. Another daughter, Florence, married Alexander of Kingsburgh, linking the two families closely. Donald MacDonald of Castleton held a captaincy in the independent Skye Companies in 1745 and later rose in the regular army. He is remembered for writing to President Forbes after the death of Sir Alexander MacDonald of Slaat in 1746. In that message, he emphasized the loyal service of Kingsburgh, who had managed family affairs for decades, and he urged that freeing him from imprisonment would be one of the greatest helps the widow and children could receive. Donald married into the MacLeods of Hamer and left an only son, John. John MacDonald of Castleton served as sheriff substitute of Skye and married within related families. Many of their sons died without children, several overseas in the West Indies or East Indies, and the direct male line of Castleton failed. Because of that, the narrative shifts back to Roderick Mac Ian of Camuscross, the second son of John of Castleton, as the line that carries the family representation forward. Roderick Mac Ian is described as a striking personality, a late example of an older Highland style of life, holding strong views on rank, public behavior, and what he considered proper respect. Stories about him emphasize sharp speech, heavy hospitality, and a rough humor. Tradition says he judged funeral prestige by how much drink was consumed and how many fights broke out, praising violent scenes as signs of respectable ancestry and mocking quiet funerals as evidence of low breeding. Other anecdotes paint him as fiercely hostile to excise officers, whom many islanders saw as enemies of their way of life. In one story, when he heard an excise man was coming to Skye, he arranged for a hard-handed follower to intercept and beat the officer, rewarding the man with a coat with silver buttons. Later, on hearing that an excise officer was again seen on the island, he was shaken, half believing the officer had returned from the dead, and he muttered a grim joke about how fresh herrings would do a man good, as if explaining survival after a brutal beating. Roderick's eldest son, Alexander MacDonald, married into the Johnstone family and was lost at sea in 1758. Their eldest son, Donald, inherited next, married Johanna Manning, and died in 1804, leaving children who continued the line. Through the failure of the elder branch, James MacDonald became the family representative and also pressed a claim connected to the Annandale peerage through his grandmother's Johnstone descent. He married into the McCarthy family and had sons who included a Wesleyan minister and a prominent naval medical officer. When James died in 1865, the male representation passed to his son, the Reverend James Alexander MacDonald, who continued the same peerage claim and had a family of sons and daughters. The valley line of the MacDonalds begins with William MacDonald, a son of Sir Donald MacDonald, the third Baronet of Sleat. who was widely remembered by the nickname Tutor of MacDonald. After the political upheaval that followed the rising of 1715, he was rewarded for loyal service to the Sleat family. He secured the farm of Aird near Duntulm on Skye as a lifetime holding, and he also gained long-term rights over the island of Valais in North Uist for a symbolic yearly payment. He fought at Sheriffmuir, and alongside his brother James, he led the Sleat MacDonalds in the opening phase of the battle. A Gaelic poet of the time, Sileas Nic Raunuil, even sent greetings in verse to Donald of Dun and to William and James as well, linking their names directly to the day's fighting. William married Catherine, a daughter of Sir Ewan Cameron of Lochiel, and they had a large family. Two of their sons became well known as officers: Captain James MacDonald of Aird in Trotternish, Skye, and Captain John MacDonald of Kirkibost in North Uist, each raised and led a company of about 100 men to Inverness in 1745 to oppose Prince Charles. Captain James married a woman from the MacDonalds of Kinloch Moidart and had one son and 3 daughters. The son later went to Australia, where he and his wife were drowned while trying to cross a river. Of the daughters, Catherine married Donald MacDonald of Balranald and had children. Isabella married Captain Charles, the eldest son of Alan MacDonald of Kingsburgh and Flora MacDonald, but had no children, and Mary never married. William also had 2 more daughters, Flora, who married and had children, and Margaret, who remained unmarried. The estate then passed to William's eldest son, Ewan MacDonald, who became the first Laird of Valais in this line. He was remembered as a classic Highland gentleman with strong cultural interests. He composed pibroch music and was also known as a skilled performer on the great Highland bagpipes. He married Mary, the daughter of the Reverend Lachlan MacLean of Call, and the old house at Valais once carried their carved initials with the date 1742, marking the family's place there. Their children included William, who followed as the next head of the house. William MacDonald, the second of Valais, married his cousin Mary, a daughter of Alexander MacDonald of Boisdale. Their children formed a wide network across the islands and beyond. The eldest son, Alexander, was heir. Another son, Ewan of Griminish, married a woman named Bruce, who had worked as a governess at Valais, and their children later connected into military and imperial service families. Several daughters married ministers serving in North Uist, and their households produced sons who joined the army or died abroad, along with daughters who either married into other island families or remained unmarried. One daughter, Margaret, married twice, and her surviving child remained in North Uist after her second husband died while she was still an infant. Other daughters married locally or died without marrying, showing the familiar pattern of large Highland families spreading through service, marriage alliances, and emigration. When William died, the estate went to his eldest son, Alexander MacDonald, the third of Valais, who became a major in the army. He married his cousin Harriet, the daughter of Colin MacDonald of Boisdale, and they had children who again link the story outward. Their eldest son, Alexander, entered the Royal Navy. A daughter, Margaret, married an engineer in Inverness, but had no children. Another daughter, Mary, died unmarried in Inverness. Isabella married a minister who served on Tiree, and their family included sons who became doctors or emigrants, and daughters who married into mainland households or remained at home. Over time, some of Isabella's descendants settled in Australia, while others stayed in Skye and the Highlands. After the third of Valais died, His naval son inherited as Alexander MacDonald, the fourth of Valais. He was born on the 14th of July, 1788, and in 1826 married Flora, a daughter of Captain Duncan McCrae of the Inverness family, who had served with the Royal York Rangers. Their children's lives show the strong pull of emigration in the 19th century. Several sons and daughters settled in Australia, with marriages and families there, while one son entered public life in the colonies and became a senator, raising a large family of his own. Their daughters also married ministers and professionals, producing further lines that stretched across Scotland and overseas. The narrative then shifts away from Valais and moves into the larger and far more contested subject of the MacDonalds of Glengarry, and the question of who could claim senior leadership within the wider Clan Donald. The Sleat MacDonalds were often treated as the direct male representatives of the last lords of the Isles. But the argument presented here insists that they could not hold the leading place by blood as long as any legitimate male descendant survived from John, first Lord of the Isles, through his first marriage to Amy McCrory of Garmaran. That claim immediately leads into another problem that had troubled historians for generations: deciding which competing branch, among several powerful families, held the strongest case for seniority. A separate issue appears alongside it, tied to the ancient earldom of Ross. Since that title had entered the MacDonald world through marriage, and since it could pass through female lines as well as male, it becomes extremely hard to identify a single modern representative. One position described here argues that if a figure known as Celestine of Lochalsh was legitimate, then the Ross representation would have moved through the Lochalsh line and into Glengarry by marriage. Another view points out that claims were pursued through the courts by other families, including a successful heir male claim made by Munro Ross of Pitcairn, while other claimants also existed through female descent. The overall point is that the earldom question is tangled, and it does not automatically settle the wider clan chief issue. At this stage, the text also addresses a claim made by the McAllisters of Loop, a notable Argyllshire family, later known as Somerville McAllisters, after marrying into an heiress line. They presented themselves as senior blood representatives from Somerled's line, but the argument here rejects their case, stating that their ancestor Alexander was not the eldest son of Angus More, and that the later transfer of lands followed a different chain of succession. The conclusion offered is that the McAllisters may be the senior cadets of the wider kindred, but they do not hold a valid claim to the chiefship of Clan Donald as a whole. From there, the story returns to the early generations of John, first Lord of the Isles. Through Amy McCrory, he had sons named John, Godfrey, and Ranald. The eldest son, John, died early, and his only son, Angus, died without children. Godfrey held Garmaran and Uist in a period where records are scarce, and his son Alexander was executed at Inverness in 1427, bringing forfeiture and a collapse of that branch's power. With that line fading, the focus narrows to Ranald, whose male descendants, as far as the narrative can trace, continued to survive and therefore remained central to any blood-based argument about seniority. Ranald, also called Reginald, is presented as the key ancestor for both Glengarry and the families broadly known as Clan Ranald. When John of the Isles entered a second marriage, an arrangement was made to divide lands and authority in a way that satisfied political pressure and reduced internal conflict. Under that deal, Ranald received extensive territories, including the North Isles and Garmaran holdings, and he later acted as guardian to his younger half-brother Donald, the second Lord of the Isles, until Donald came of age. Ranald is described as acting with restraint and honor, handing over authority formally, even though many ordinary islanders still looked to his elder brother Godfrey as the rightful head. The text then moves into the heart of the old controversy. If Ranald's line carried the strongest blood claim within the wider kindred, then which branch descended from Ranald should be seen as the senior house within that line. The argument presented favors the descendants of Ranald's son Donald, stating that this was the eldest surviving branch, while another powerful branch in Moidart rose to prominence later through circumstances and a contested takeover of leadership. The claim is that the Moidart captains held real influence on the ground, especially after political pressure and land transfers weakened the older chief line, but that the right of blood would still belong to the Donald descendant line, which in time became associated with Glengarry after the extinction of the senior Knoydart branch. The account then outlines Ranald's marriage into the Stuart family of Atholl and lists his children, placing Donald first as the direct ancestor of Glengarry, followed by Alan as the ancestor of the Clan Ranald house, then John, remembered in tradition as Blind John, and several others. Ranald is said to have died in 1419 at an advanced age, and he was followed by his eldest son, Donald MacRanald, described as a shadowy figure in the surviving record. The explanation offered is that Ranald's children were still young and were pushed aside for a time by their uncle Godfrey, who held Uist and Garmarin and took the leading title there, even while not challenging the wider Isles claim connected to the second marriage line. After the execution of Godfrey's son in 1427, Glengarry lands fell back under Crown control for a time, and the family later worked its way back toward secure possession through royal grants and charters. Donald MacRanald is then said to have married twice. By his first wife, a daughter of MacIver, he had John as his successor. By a second marriage into another notable family, he had sons named Alistair and Angus Og. With that, the narrative prepares to move into the next generation, where the Glengarry line becomes clearer and more fully recorded. The next head of the house, the third of Glengarry, married into the MacLeods of Lewis, and had a son who carried the line forward. Alistair MacDonald became the fourth of Glengarry, and his name mattered for another reason. Later generations of the family took their Gaelic style from him, meaning the sons of Alistair. He is also the first Glengarry figure who clearly shows up in official records. One early reference does not name him as a chief in his own right, but as the grandfather of a man listed in a royal commission connected to the government of the Isles and certain lands in Morar. Not long after, he appears again in a legal setting under a form of name that identifies him as a son of John and grandson of Alistair, tied directly to Glengarry. From that point onward, his name continues to surface in later notices. Alistair married the only daughter of Hector MacLean of Duart, and they had several sons. John was the heir. A second son, Aeneas, became the ancestor of a later branch known locally as the Scythian line. Another son, also named John, earned a distinguishing byname and settled in Loch Carron. From him came a group remembered in the north as the descendants of John Odhar, spread through districts like Strathglass and other parts of the Highlands. Over time, some of that group adopted the surname MacNair, and many families from Strathglass later emigrated to Canada, especially to Nova Scotia. When Alistair died, the leadership passed to his eldest son, John MacDonald, the fifth of Glengarry. John married a cousin connected to the Camerons of Lochiel through the MacLeans of Duart. Their marriage produced a single son, Alexander, who inherited next and became the sixth of Glengarry. Alexander is recorded early as a leading man of Morvern, and Glengarry in a formal bond of service and support made to the Earl of Argyll, who at the time held royal authority in that region. Later documents show him recovering income and dues from Glengarry and Morar that had been held back for years because of succession delays after his father's death. Around the same period, a major charter granted him and his wife Margaret extensive holdings, including Glengarry, Morar, the stronghold at Strome, and significant lands in Lochulsh and surrounding districts. That marriage changed the family's position dramatically because Margaret brought with her a powerful inheritance connected to Lochulsh. In later disputes, opponents tried to smear Margaret's reputation by confusing her with another woman of the same name from the wider kin group. The version presented here rejects that attack and insists the lady who married Glengarry was not the notorious figure described by hostile writers, but a different Margaret entirely. She is described as a granddaughter of Celestine of Lochulsh, and as sister and co-heiress of Sir Donald of Lochulsh, who died without children. Through her, Alexander gained half of those estates, and with them a stronger base of power and influence than Glengarry had held before. Records from the period also show violent conflict around the great fortress of Urquhart, with several Highland leaders named in legal action over its seizure and the losses claimed. In this telling, Alexander's marriage to Margaret is emphasized again as the key reason the Glengarry line rose in strength, because it tied the family to a chain of descent that some believed connected to older honors associated with Ross and the Lords of the Isles. The next generation is introduced through Aeneas MacDonald, the seventh of Glengarry. Under his name, a major charter confirms wide estates, but it also reveals how precarious power could be. At one point, lands were taken from him through legal process by the grants of Freuchi, and the document lists a long stretch of places and holdings affected by that pressure. Another episode shows the Privy Council dealing with violence in the West. A mariner was killed while fishing in waters tied to Glengarry's authority, and the perpetrators were said to be within the bounds of Glengarry's tenants. Aeneas was ordered to hold local courts and bring the accused to judgment using a jury drawn from merchants and sailors arriving for the next fishing season, showing how the crown tried to force law into places where clan power usually ruled. Aeneas married 3 times. His first wife, Janet, connected to the MacLeans of Duart, gave him his only son, Donald, the heir. A second marriage to Margaret MacLeod linked the family to another important Highland house, and from that union came a daughter named Margaret, who married into the Cuthberts of Castle Hill near Inverness. A third marriage to Mary, a daughter from the Mackenzie line of Kintail, produced a daughter Elizabeth, who married into the Gairloch Mackenzies. After Aeneas died, Mary later remarried into the Chisholm family of Comer. Donald MacDonald then became the 8th of Glengarry. Charters describe him as the lawful male heir to his father and confirm his succession to the major estates. In Gaelic tradition, he was remembered by a patronymic that traced him clearly through Angus and Alistair, and he was styled as a man of Morar, Knoydart, and Glengarry. Legal records later show formal inquests confirming his right to inherit through his grandmother Margaret of the Isles and Lochulsh, tying his claim to the wider web of land and lineage that had come into the family through marriage. A later return made in Edinburgh lists prominent Highland jurors, including leading men from Sleit and the Clanranald line, and it is presented as a powerful statement in favor of Celestine's legitimacy and of Glengarry's descent through that connection. The argument in this narrative is blunt. If those chiefs and gentlemen swore to that ancestry in a formal setting, then later denials by their descendants look like politics rather than truth. The same section also repeats that hostile polemics confused the respectable Margaret, who married into Glengarry, with a different Margaret whose behavior had drawn royal attention, and it points out contradictions in the writings of those who tried to make that accusation stick. Beyond genealogy, the story turns sharply into the violent reality of the age. Donald and his house were drawn into fierce disputes with the Grants as well. At one point, an agreement was made for his son to marry a Grant daughter, but the son refused. That refusal helped trigger legal retaliation, and the Glengarry lands were once again pressured through court actions and financial claims until a later settlement restored them by charter. In one bond, Glengarry made a statement that seemed to recognize the captain of Clanranald as a chief figure, and later writers argued over what that meant. The interpretation offered here is practical rather than romantic. At that moment, Clanranald's captain was simply too powerful to ignore, while Glengarry was politically weaker, so words that looked like submission may have been forced by circumstance rather than by blood right. From about 1580 onward, the Glengarry world is depicted as locked in almost constant feud with the Mackenzies. The conflict began with disputes over Strome Castle and neighboring lands in Lochalsh and Loch Carron, territories Glengarry claimed through the Lochalsh marriage. In a society where rival clans lived side by side, that kind of overlap was a recipe for raids, reprisals, and long memory. Angus Og of Glengarry is presented as a fierce and reckless war leader who carried fire and violence into Mackenzie country, and the Mackenzies struck back with equal determination. The feud is then told through a chain of brutal incidents. A skilled hunter connected to the Loch Carron MacDonalds, known for stalking deer, was confronted in the hills by a Mackenzie forester. The confrontation escalated, and the hunter and his companion were killed and buried secretly. When their remains were later discovered, MacDonald men sought revenge and killed a man they believed was linked to the earlier crime. That murder provoked demands for justice from powerful neighbors, but Glengarry refused to hand over the killers or offer satisfaction, and the feud widened. A plan was then laid to seize Glengarry himself. A meeting was arranged at Kishorn under the appearance of friendly negotiation, while armed men waited in ambush at a narrow place along the route. Glengarry arrived with his wife, then sent her home by boat, and walked back with his followers. On the road, the trap closed. His men fought and were cut down, while Glengarry threw away his weapon and surrendered when he realized he would not be killed if he gave himself up. He was carried away as a captive into Mackenzie territory. While Glengarry was being held, another dark twist followed. Men connected to Loch Carron, who carried old grievances against their chief, attacked and killed several of Glengarry's close relatives and their households during the night. The narrative insists the Mackenzies were not responsible for this particular slaughter, and it claims some Mackenzie leaders were disturbed by it. Even so, when Glengarry was released, he complained to the Privy Council, and official records show that the Crown treated the matter seriously enough to interfere with control of Strome Castle, and to keep Mackenzie leaders under legal restraint for a time. As the years passed, the feud did not cool. The sons of murdered relatives grew up and sought revenge of their own, burning enemies inside their homes and carrying violence into places that had once been treated as safe ground. Accusations and counter-accusations reached the Privy Council again. At one dramatic point, Glengarry tried to pursue charges against Mackenzie leadership, but churchmen tied to the Mackenzies responded with harsh allegations against Glengarry himself, including claims of oppression, sexual violence, and idolatry. In this retelling, the pressure became so heavy that Glengarry fled rather than face the full weight of the accusations, and the Crown eventually treated him as an outlaw. A commission was granted that authorized armed action against him and his followers, along with demands for compensation for damage and loss. The war that followed is described as large-scale. Mackenzie leadership gathered a powerful force, drawing support from neighboring houses, and marched into Glengarry lands. The MacDonalds tried to save their wealth by driving cattle into Morar under guard, but they were attacked, defeated, and stripped of an enormous herd that was then distributed among the victors. At the same time, Mackenzie men expelled many of Glengarry's followers from holdings in Lochalsh and Loch Carron, keeping only those who submitted and proved loyalty through violence against their former allies. Strome Castle, however, still remained a key point of struggle. Even after major raids, counter-raids continued. MacDonald war leaders struck at vulnerable groups on the move, killing women and children and destroying livestock they could not carry away. The story closes this section with another grim episode. A raid by sea into Applecross, where fugitives had taken shelter with their cattle. The attackers found only a few herdsmen, killed them, slaughtered the livestock, and sailed away with whatever the boats could hold, showing how the feud had reached a level where no place felt protected and no restraint was left. Not long after the raid at Applecross, Glengarry pulled together a new coalition. Men from Moydart joined him, along with the clan Ian Widder and other MacDonald groups. Together they gathered a fleet of 37 Burlins, planning to sail toward Lochbroom and then return along the coast, burning and stripping Mackenzie territory in the west. They reached a sea inlet near Killican, a place known as Loch na Baist, across from Lochalsh. From there, Glengarry sent Alexander McGorry ahead as a scout, taking 80 men in a large galley to check the shoreline before the main force moved in. McGorry landed again at Applecross, on the same coast where he had killed 2 Kintail men earlier. Kintail was away at the time, visiting Mackenzie of Gairloch, but the news reached him quickly. He ordered the coast to be put on alert and sent a small galley south under Alexander Mackenzie of Akilty, with 16 fighting men and 8 oarsmen to watch for the enemy and reconnoiter as far as Kyler Hia. By chance, that patrol landed at Applecross on the north side of the point where McGorry had come ashore. There they saw a woman collecting shellfish. The moment she noticed them, she told them a great galley had landed earlier that morning on the far side of the headland. The Mackenzie party immediately guessed this was an enemy scout. They sent their boat around the point with the rowers, while the armed men cut straight across the narrow strip of land. Halfway over, they found a MacDonald sentry asleep on the ground. They killed him silently, then grabbed a set of bagpipes lying nearby. Using the pipes as a trick, they charged forward with noise and confidence. The MacDonalds, startled by the sudden piping and convinced a large force was crashing down on them, panicked and ran for their boat. McGorry did not run. He had boasted he would never turn his back on an enemy, and he tried to hold his ground alone. Outnumbered, he was forced back until he reached a rock where he could protect his rear. With his back against stone, he fought fiercely, catching arrows on his targe and keeping men at distance even after an arrow struck him low under the belt. No one wanted to rush him while he still stood, so one Mackenzie man circled behind the rock carrying a heavy boulder. He dropped it onto McGorry's head and killed him instantly. Whatever else could be said about MacGorry, his death removed one of the most capable fighting leaders Glengarry had. The Mackenzies immediately pushed back to their boat and pursued the fleeing galley toward Loch na Baist. When they saw the full MacDonald fleet coming out against them, they tried to escape by sea. The enemy gained on them, so they turned back and landed again at Applecross, barely avoiding being caught at the shore. They abandoned their boat and ran for their lives, chased hard by MacDonalds, and would likely have been trapped if one man had not known the ground well enough to guide them through a hidden ford between rocks. Night fell, and the chase finally broke. The MacDonalds returned to their boats and found MacGorry's body. His death turned their confidence into grief. Taking it as a bad sign and fearing worse to come, they carried him with them, sailed home, and dismissed the assembled force rather than push deeper into enemy waters. The Mackenzie party reached the house at Loch Maree and reported everything. Kintail, hearing the details, decided the MacDonald threat needed a stronger answer. He was also told the MacDonalds had withdrawn to their own districts, and while he was away, a temporary truce had been arranged. People on both sides agreed to stop fighting until Lammas. Kintail had not been present and did not know about the agreement. Young Glengarry, however, ignored the pleas of his father, who accepted the pause. He marched into Glenshiel and Letterfern with a strong force, while Alan MacDonald of Lundy struck another area at the same time. They looted, drove off cattle, and killed defenseless people, including old men who could not flee, several women, and the male children they found. Most able-bodied men had already withdrawn to gather and defend themselves later, so the raiders found few strong opponents. One exception was a man named Duncan in Killichertorn. The MacDonalds seized him and were ready to kill him, but one of the raiders, who had once been his friend, persuaded young Glengarry to spare him and send him as a prisoner to Strome Castle instead, where a garrison still held. That success fed Angus's confidence. He began to believe fortune had finally shifted in his favor, so he went personally from leader to leader across the western branches of the MacDonalds, asking for a larger combined effort against the Mackenzies in the spring. Word of this reached Kintail. At that time, Kintail was staying in Icelandonan Castle. Alarmed by the idea of a grand MacDonald coalition, he sailed secretly to Mull to consult Maclean of Duart, his brother-in-law. He explained that he held authority to act against Glengarry and anyone who rose in arms to help him, and he asked Maclean to block nearby MacDonald groups from joining the war. Maclean agreed, promising that if necessary he would pressure the MacDonalds of Isla, Glencoe, and Ardnamurchan at home, so they could not spare men for Glengarry. Old Glengarry still wanted a lasting peace, but Angus would not accept it. He chose war, despite his father's warning that he did not expect him to come back alive. Taking advantage of Kintail's absence, Angus quietly gathered every boat and large galley he could. In late November, moving under darkness, he slipped through the Kyles and reached Loch Carron. At twilight, he put men ashore. The locals fled into the hills, but the raiders killed those who could not run, including elderly men and many women and children. They seized cattle, slaughtered some for provisions, and loaded what they could into their boats. Before they finished, alarm signals spread through Lochalsh and Kintail, and groups of defenders began to appear. Angus judged it too dangerous to stay. The fleet pushed back to sea under a hail of arrows, which did little once they were out of range. The Kintail men raced back toward Islandanane. They sent a fast group overland to Invernate to bring a newly built 12-oared galley that had not yet been tested at sea. The messengers returned so quickly that the boat was back at the castle before many of the others arrived from Loch Carron. That night they prepared for pursuit, and Kintail's wife took a direct role. She helped choose the best men, handed out powder and shot herself, and even provided small brass guns. She placed Duncan MacGillecriost in command of the galley while his father was away, and urged the men to defend the honor of the house in her husband's absence. The crew did not need much urging. They still burned with anger over broken truces and fresh injuries. They launched into a calm, moonlit night with light snow showers. To stay silent, they padded the rowlocks with seaweed. Believing the MacDonalds would wait for the next tide change to pass Kyler Hia, the Kintail crew pressed forward, hungry to catch them. As they advanced, they saw a small boat rowing hard toward them. Thinking it was an enemy scout testing the passage, they let it pass and continued north, searching for Angus's main galley. Near a low rock called the Cailleach, they spotted the lead vessel ahead of the rest of the fleet. It was Angus's own great galley. Angus shouted, asking who they were, twice, then a third time. No one answered. Instead, the Kintail men fired a sudden broadside from their guns. The shots crippled the galley and drove it onto the rock. In the chaos, Angus's men surged toward the front of the boat, believing they had hit shore. Their movement capsized the vessel and flooded it. Then they realized what lay around them: open water and darkness, with enemies closing in. Some Kintail men went ashore to kill anyone who managed to swim toward land. Others stayed by the boats, striking down or drowning those still in the water. By the end, none of the roughly 60 men from Angus's galley escaped alive. Angus himself was pulled aboard, still breathing, wounded in the head and body, but he died before morning. Hearing the fighting, men from Lochailsh rushed out in small boats to join, but they arrived too late. Only a few MacDonalds were still alive when help reached the scene. Angus of Glengarry was finished, brave, daring, and admired by his followers, yet reckless and badly lacking in strategic caution. The rest of the MacDonald fleet, more than 20 boats, heard the uproar and fled back toward Cailleach in panic, so confused that they feared even their own allies were chasing them. They landed, abandoned their boats and their half-cooked meat, and fled inland through sleet until they could be ferried back to the mainland in small craft. Back at Island Anane, Kintail's wife had only heard distant cannon in the night and did not know the outcome. At dawn, she saw the returning galley, with another vessel alongside, and hurried to the shore. The leader told her they had brought home a guest without losing a man. She looked and recognized Angus's body. She ordered it carried out and treated with respect. The men first suggested burying him in a traditional tomb site in Lochailsh, but she refused. She said her husband would never allow a MacDonald to hold even a grave there, and she ordered Angus buried instead with her own children and the children of the Kintail line in the tomb at Kilditch. In her view, it was no insult, since Angus was kin by blood in the broad web of Highland families. The burial was arranged with what honor the place could provide, and Angus was laid in that tomb the next day. Some later gossip claimed he was buried in a doorway where people walked over him. A 17th century account rejected that as a malicious lie and insisted his grave was proper, even claiming the writer had seen the head lifted from the grave and returned again during a later disturbance, with 2 small cuts visible. After the funeral, Kintail's wife worried about her husband's safe return from Mull. MacDonald boats still prowled southern bays, so she sent a trusted messenger to plan a safe route. Soon, a large MacLean Berlin, led by the captain of Cairnburg and accompanied by other MacLean gentlemen, went out to escort Kintail home. The MacDonalds tried to set an ambush along the route, gathering boats at an island they believed Kintail could not avoid. But the escort captain used a clever feint. He sailed straight toward the harbor as if expected, lowered sail to make the watchers think he was friendly, then suddenly raised sail, set oars, and turned away while a piper played and shots were fired. The ambushers scrambled in confusion, damaging boats and injuring themselves in the rush. And when they saw the escort already far off, they abandoned the chase. Kintail returned to Islandanen late at night. He congratulated his men for protecting the house and keeping control in his absence, though he could not pretend to be unmoved by the death of a troublesome relative. He also knew the MacDonalds would not let the killing stand unanswered. To prevent a fresh cycle of revenge, he decided to force them out of the district, if possible. The greatest obstacle was Strome Castle, still held by Glengarry. It offered refuge whenever MacDonalds were pursued. In the spring, Kintail raised a strong force and besieged it. The defenders resisted stubbornly and rejected surrender terms, so Kintail chose to pull back rather than bleed men in a costly assault. Then misfortune struck inside the castle. Women sent out at night to fetch water returned in fear and darkness, and accidentally poured water into the wrong vat, soaking the small supply of gunpowder. By morning, with the previous day's powder spent, the defenders found their barrels ruined and floating. A prisoner held inside, Duncan Mackyan Mich Gillicallum, learned what had happened. Allowed some freedom within the walls because he had sworn not to escape, he saw his chance. When his keepers brought him to the ramparts, he threw his plaid over a nearby guard's head, jumped the wall onto a dung heap below, recovered from the fall, and ran to Kintail's camp to report the castle's weakened state. Kintail immediately renewed the siege and moved scaling ladders closer. The defenders realized their powder was useless and that their situation had been exposed. They offered to surrender if their lives were spared and they could carry away their goods. Kintail accepted. The garrison marched out, and afterward the castle was blown up with powder, leaving ruins that remained visible long after. Kintail reportedly lost only 2 men in the siege, with a few others wounded, and then broke camp. Even after Strome was taken, the feud did not end overnight. In 1603, a Glengarry force led by Alan Dubh of Lundy raided Mackenzie territory in Bray Ross, plundered lands around Killicreost, and set fire to the church during worship while it was full of families. The story describes the scene as a cold-blooded atrocity and notes how shocking it is that such an act seems to have brought little direct public punishment at the time. In the end, the 2 powerful houses eventually reached a settlement. The contested lands in Rossshire were conceded to Mackenzie, and Glengarry accepted harsh terms in the private quarrel. After that agreement, the families kept a workable peace that benefited both sides and steadied a wide region. With Angus dead and Donald MacAngus extremely old, day-to-day leadership shifted to the second son, Alexander, remembered as Alistair Dearg. He was far more inclined toward restraint than his brother, but he too died before his father. So although he commanded men while Donald still lived, he was never truly the laird in his own right. After Alistair Dearg died, the burden of command passed again, this time to Donald's grandson Angus, also known as Aeneas, the son of Alistair Dearg. A Privy Council order from December 1641 treats this grandson as the acting head of the clan, because the old laird was near 100 years of age and too frail to manage affairs. The order makes the point plainly. Since the grandson controlled the estate in practice and was obeyed by tenants and dependents, he was responsible for producing accused men of the clan and ensuring public peace. When he refused to provide the required guarantees and refused to hand over the men demanded, he was committed to Edinburgh Castle until he complied, then later released to open ward in Edinburgh under surety. We have already covered the old bargain made with Grant of Freuchie. Glengarry promised that his son Donald would marry Grant's daughter, and when Donald refused, the fallout hit the family hard. Yet despite the broken agreement, the girl seems to have stayed close to him for a time, living with him in Strome Castle at Loch Carron. It fits a rough practice that existed in some places back then, where a promised bride might live in the household as a kind of trial arrangement before any proper wedding was completed. Because of that, many people in the district assumed she was his lawful wife, even though she was not. Later, when the Privy Council took up complaints against him in 1602, one accusation claimed he was openly living with another woman, the daughter of the captain of Clanranald, after sending away the Grant woman who was being described, wrongly, as his married wife. Old Mackenzie writers say the same thing in plainer language. They describe him bringing the Clanranald girl into Strome and sending Grant's daughter away. This helps explain why Grant was so determined to press the issue and punish the family, demanding the penalties written into the original agreement once the marriage was not carried through. It also explains how later enemies tried to twist the story into a darker claim, arguing that Alistair Dearg was illegitimate and that the Glengarry line was therefore compromised. That argument collapses once we look at the one point that actually matters. Everyone, even rivals, accepted that Donald of Glengarry did enter a legitimate marriage with the daughter of Alan MacDonald of Clanranald. The only angle that could have damaged that marriage would be proof of an earlier, legally valid marriage to Helen Grant, and there was no such marriage. The loudest critic in the later feud threw around so many contradictions that his claims stopped being useful as evidence. In one breath, he tried to link Alistair Dearg to one Donald, then to another, and even ended up describing him as both the son and the brother of the same man. When a case rests on that kind of tangled storytelling, it is clear the writer is scrambling to escape his own earlier claims rather than setting down reliable facts. What we can say with confidence is simple. Donald of Glengarry married first Margaret, the daughter of Alan MacDonald of Moidart, the captain of Clanranald, and a granddaughter of the famous John Moidartach. From that marriage came several sons who shaped the later branches of the family. The eldest was Alexander, remembered by the nickname Alistair Dearg. He married Jeanne, the daughter of Alan Cameron of Lochiel. Their son was Aeneas, the man later raised to the peerage as Lord MacDonald and Eros in 1660. Alistair Dearg died before his father Donald, so Aeneas ended up succeeding not his father, but his grandfather as chief of Glengarry. Donald also had a second son named Donald, known by the label Scotus or Scott House. He married Mary, the daughter of Sir Donald MacDonald of Sleat. Their line continued through Reginald, who became second of Scotus and married into the MacLeod family. From that branch came Alistair Dubh MacDonald, who would later succeed to Glengarry when Lord MacDonald and Eros died without lawful issue in 1682, along with other sons whose stories continue later. Two more sons are mentioned as well. One was John, called Ian Moore, founder of the Ardena Here family line, whose descendants later emigrated to America. Another was John, also known as Ian Og, whose descendants likewise went to America. Alongside the legitimate children, there was also a natural son named Angus, linked to Helen Grant, the daughter of Freuchie. This Angus was killed at Kyleakin by the Mackenzies. He was later formally legitimated by official authority, and the narrative suggests that if he had lived, he might well have been positioned to inherit Glengarry. After Margaret's death, Glengarry married again, taking a daughter of MacDonald of Keppoch as his second wife. He lived to an extreme old age, said to be over 100, and died on Sunday, the 2nd of February, 1645. The same day, Montrose won the Battle of Inverlochy. Men from Glengarry fought there, led not by the ancient Donald himself, but by his grandson and successor. That successor was Aeneas MacDonald, 9th of Glengarry, later raised to the Scottish peerage in 1660 with the title Lord MacDonald and Eros. On the very day his grandfather died, Aeneas was on campaign with Montrose at Inverlochy, since his own father Donald had already died some years earlier. He was not alone. His 3 uncles were with him too, Donald of Scotus, Ian More, and Ian Og, all remembered as hard fighters and firm supporters of the Stuart cause. From the moment Glengarry joined Montrose in 1644, he stayed close to him. Together they moved into Argyll, and the campaigning there was brutal and destructive, leaving wide areas devastated. Contemporary royalist writers praised Glengarry for courage, loyalty to the king, and strong attachment to Montrose across the whole sweep of that war. In 1647, he crossed to Ireland with the Earl of Antrim. The Highland regiment he commanded there was struck by a stronger force under Sir Thomas Esmond and crushed. Many of his men were killed, and Glengarry himself, along with several officers, was taken prisoner. A few years later, in August 1653, Glengarry was present at a meeting at Lochern, where plans were being laid for a new rising under Glencairn. He later joined Glencairn with 300 followers. Several important figures were involved in that gathering, including Atholl, Loam, and Lochiel, and the force briefly looked impressive on paper. But the coalition was unstable. Loam arrived with a large body of men, then slipped away soon after, making for Ruthven Castle, where English troops were stationed. Glencairn, furious at what looked like desertion, sent mounted men after him under Glengarry and Lochiel, ordering them to bring Loam back or attack if he refused. Glengarry caught them close to Ruthven. Loam escaped with part of his horse, but some were captured and brought back. The foot soldiers halted on a hill near the castle and agreed to return, and Glengarry, who carried a deep hostility toward the Campbells after the Montrose Wars, wanted to fall on them anyway. He was restrained only because Glencairn arrived in time and blocked a fight. Glencairn demanded they lay down their weapons before any terms were discussed, and after they surrendered their arms, they swore obedience and loyalty. Even so, they drifted away again within a fortnight, proving how fragile the whole effort was. In that same year, the exiled Charles granted Glengarry a commission making him a major general over foot forces raised for royal service in Scotland. The wording is the usual language of war authority: command, discipline, and the power to act against enemies while still obeying the superior commanders appointed over him. Cromwell's government had already punished Glengarry for his loyalty to the Stuarts, but after the Restoration, Charles II rewarded him. On the 20th of December 1660, he was created Lord MacDonald and Aros, with the honor limited to heirs male of his body. After receiving that rank, he pushed even further, making formal claims not only to leadership over the Clanranald branches, but to the wider headship of Clandonald as a whole, presenting himself as the senior male representative of the ancient line. Not long after, a new conflict erupted, this time with the town of Inverness. In August 1665, a fair day turned into chaos over something as small as a cheese in the horse market. A townsman handled a cheese, it fell and rolled down into the river, and the seller demanded payment. Words became threats, threats became blows, and the whole hillside market ignited into a brawl. The town guard arrived to separate the crowd, but the crowd would not settle. Weapons came out, shots were fired, and men were killed and wounded. In the aftermath, anger sharpened because some of the dead were MacDonald men. Even though the fighting began as a tangled market riot, both sides treated it like an insult that demanded a reckoning. Corpses were carried to the riverbank as a bitter statement against the town, and local gentry and neighbors tried to calm the situation by calling it a chance outbreak rather than a planned attack. But the MacDonald side promised revenge, and the town prepared for the worst. As fear spread, Inverness asked nearby noblemen and gentlemen for advice and support, and the town began gathering defenders. When the MacDonalds heard this, they responded with demands so extreme they felt like a message of domination rather than negotiation. They proposed that the town should enter an offensive and defensive alliance with them, immediately bind itself to an enormous money penalty in their favor, surrender certain rights and claims, identify and hand over the men who had drawn MacDonald blood, repay losses on the MacDonald's own valuation, and even require Inverness men to lay down arms on sight of Lord MacDonald's followers as a sign of obedience. They also wanted expenses paid for the time there. The town council refused to accept such terms, saying they would consider neutral mediation only after the MacDonald force dispersed. The dispute went up to the Privy Council, and Inverness sent commissioners to Edinburgh with instructions to press their case hard, defend the burgh's reputation, and bring the town's charter documents to prove the boundaries of its authority. The town's argument was that Inverness had long suffered oppression from neighboring clans and had royal permission to defend itself and punish disorder within its limits. They pointed to earlier incidents where MacDonald men had broken into the town's holding place and rescued prisoners, and they claimed that the Fair Day violence grew worse when MacDonald men attacked the guard, disarmed them, and then gathered in numbers nearby. When townsmen approached to demand the surrender of a named attacker, the town claimed those men were nearly killed. The guard intervened, shots were exchanged, and then MacDonald leaders threatened to march on the town, burn it, and slaughter the inhabitants unless huge concessions were granted. According to the town, panic followed, trade collapsed, families fled with their goods, and the town was forced into constant watch. Despite all this, the case ended in a way Inverness did not want. The MacDonalds won their action, and the Privy Council ordered the town to pay damages to Glengarry, along with the fees for the surgeon who treated the wounded MacDonalds. The fallout did not stop there. The town later complained that some neighbors had filed petitions to distance themselves from any collective penalties connected to the disturbance. In response, Inverness decided certain named protesters should never again be accepted as councillors, treating them as ill-affected within the burgh. A few years later, the Privy Council issued a strong order that shows the scale of Glengarry's public responsibility. In July 1672, Aeneas Lord MacDonald was commanded to appear and to produce certain leading men, including Keppoch, and to provide binding guarantees that their people would keep the peace and commit none of the major crimes that haunted the Highlands. The order even included a safeguard stating that the general bond should not be used to force them from disputed lands, so long as they were willing to pay rent, as they had done for years. Until the day of appearance, the council held Lord MacDonald answerable under a large financial penalty, and it granted the named men protection for a set period before and after their appearance, so they could come without being seized for unrelated civil debts or criminal matters. This document matters because it shows that Lord MacDonald was treated as responsible not only for his immediate followers on Glengarry lands, but for important branches and leading tenants elsewhere in the wider clan network. In October 1673, Lord MacDonald also entered a formal friendship contract with Duncan Macpherson of Cluny. The agreement bound both houses and their successors to honor and defend each other, stressing the old tradition of mutual support between their predecessors. It is presented as a deliberate renewal of an ancient understanding, with each chief taking responsibility not just for himself, but for his whole name, dependents, and followers. Lord MacDonald married Margaret, a daughter of Sir Donald MacDonald of Sleat, but they had no children. He died in 1682. With no lawful issue from him, the representation of the family shifted back to the Scotus branch, to Reginald, eldest son of Donald of Scotus, who was himself the second son of Donald MacAngus MacAllister. That is where the succession line turns next, continuing through the descendants of Donald of Scotus and his marriage into Sleat. Reginald, the second Laird of Scotus, was still alive in 1695. He later became the 10th chief of Glengarry and married a daughter of MacLeod of MacLeod. They had several sons who founded important offshoots of the family, and from this point the story splits into lines that keep reappearing in later Highland politics. His main heir was Alistair Dubh MacDonald, who would succeed both to the Glengarry title and to leadership of the clan. Another son was Angus, also called Aeneas, to whom Reginald granted the lands and barony of Scotus. In this setup, Alistair Dubh took Glengarry, while Angus held Scotus as his own base. Much later, descendants of this Scotus branch argued that their line represented the senior male continuation, and therefore should be seen as the true inheritors of the chiefship, a claim that resurfaced strongly in the 19th century. A third son, John, became the founder of the MacDonalds of Lochgarry. He married Helen, daughter of Donald Cameron of Lochiel, and their line continued through Donald, the second of Lochgarry. Donald married Isabella Gordon of Glenlivet and had 3 sons, John, who died unmarried, Alexander, who became the third of Lochgarry, and Peter, who died young. Alexander entered Portuguese service, rose to high military rank, and married a noblewoman from Portugal, Dona Maria José de Costa, linked to the House of Sur. Their son Anthony became the 4th of Lochgarry. Anthony married Cassandra Eliza MacDonald, connected to the MacDonalds of the Grange, and their son Alexander Anthony became the 5th of Lochgarry, serving as a colonel in the Indian Army. He married Margaret Jane, daughter of Lachlan MacLean, and their children included Arthur Anthony MacDonald, educated at Oxford and later regarded as the leading representative of that Lochgarry family line, alongside other sons and daughters. Family tradition adds a dramatic exile story to the Lochgarry branch after the Jacobite defeat. In that account, Donald of Lochgarry fled to France with Charles Edward, and his wife later escaped with their 3 sons, while government troops destroyed the old home and ravaged the surrounding lands. The story says the 2 older boys entered a Scottish Guard unit, and the youngest went into another foreign guard service. Donald is described as staying close to the exiled prince in Paris, still wearing full Highland dress, and becoming a striking figure even in fashionable French society. That same tradition then turns darker. It describes an incident in a Paris cafe where Donald reacted violently to men mocking the prince and his Highland followers, and it claims he fought several opponents one after another. Later, it says his eldest son John tried to return toward Britain without telling him. When Donald caught up with him, The tale says he pronounced a severe family curse against any descendant who returned to Britain, submitted to the ruling dynasty, or tried to reclaim Loch-Garry. The tradition claims Donald died soon after, broken by grief, and that the shadow of this curse haunted the family for generations. In that telling, John did return and gained rank in British service. And when he later tried to live again at Loch-Garry, after rebuilding on the old site, he was supposedly driven away by eerie disturbances and constant fear. The story says he died back in France, leaving the claim to his brother Alexander, who refused to return because of the curse and stayed in Portuguese service. After Alexander's death, their son Anthony was brought from Portugal to Britain. But the tradition insists the same haunting troubles continued, and that Anthony died young after selling Loch-Garry, with legal restrictions having blocked any secure inheritance settlement. Reginald's other sons included Donald, who married and was killed at Killiecrankie, with his children not clearly traced in this passage, and Archibald, who founded the MacDonalds of Barrisdale, a branch that later died out in the direct male line. When Reginald died, Glengarry passed to his eldest son, Alistair Dubh MacDonald, now the 11th chief. He quickly gained a reputation as one of the most formidable Highland war leaders of his generation. He and his father were among the earliest to join Viscount Dundee in the rising to restore James II. Government commanders tried to break Dundee's coalition with bribes, sending offers to Highland chiefs. Glengarry's reply, as the story tells it, showed open contempt for the money and flipped the argument back at the government, urging them to restore the rightful king instead. Because Alistair's father was old and frail, the young heir led the clan in person. On the 18th of May, 1689, in Lochaber, he arrived with around 300 men. Soon, other MacDonald forces joined, followed by Camerons, Keppoch men, and larger contingents under Lochiel. At that moment, the Jacobite camp felt confident, and some leaders believed that if allies hesitated to land troops or commit fully, they might miss their chance to play a major role. At Killiecrankie, the Glengarry and Clanranald MacDonalds were positioned in the centre under Dundee's eye, alongside Camerons, an Irish regiment, and a small horse troop. When the first charge began, Mackay's troops met them with a hard burst of fire, and many Glengarry gentlemen fell early. Even so, the Highland line kept coming. They closed the distance under fire, paused only briefly, loosed pistols with little effect, and then rushed in with claymores before the government troops could properly secure bayonets. The collapse was sudden. The government line broke into flight, and the pursuit became a slaughter. The narrative portrays Alistair Dubh performing almost legendary feats in that clash, holding a royal standard and cutting a path through the enemy in the crush of close combat. The same tradition says he lost close kin, including his brother Donald, and it also laments the death of his son, Donald Gorm, described as a young warrior of great promise who fought with frightening effectiveness before being killed. Later that year, the Jacobites suffered a serious reverse at Dunkeld. Confidence in their leadership crumbled, and many Highland forces withdrew to reorganize and protect themselves. They formed a mutual bond to continue backing King James and to stand together for safety, then returned to their districts with plans to gather again with set numbers of fighting men. When Mackay pressed them to negotiate and accept government terms, their response, as retold here, was proud and absolute. They rejected the new regime, mocked offers of pardon, and declared they would rather die armed than abandon their oath to their king. As the war effort weakened, senior officers drifted into exile or into the hospitality of powerful chiefs. Some leaders stayed for a time at Glengarry's residence, still hoping, however faintly, that the Stuart cause might revive. Others found shelter with Sleat, treated with the same respect, and kept alive the same dream of restoration. In August 1691, the government issued an offer of indemnity for those who submitted and swore allegiance by the 1st of January 1692. Most chiefs accepted within the deadline, with one famous exception. Separate arrangements were also made to move certain Jacobite generals out of Scotland to France, since they could no longer operate effectively at home. Jumping forward, we later see how unstable Highland loyalty could be in the years leading to the Rising of 1715. Glengarry was among those who signed a letter professing loyalty to King George, promising to serve him as readily as they had served under Queen Anne. Yet not long after, he appeared among the chiefs who met at a so-called hunting gathering at Braemar to plan a rising for the Chevalier. Warrants went out to seize leading chiefs. Some were caught, but Glengarry avoided capture. When battle came at Sheriffmuir, Glengarry appeared at the head of a strong force of his own men and fought with distinction. Accounts of the battle describe a furious Highland attack on one wing that quickly shattered the enemy's formation in the confusion and smoke. Even writers who had no reason to flatter him still described him as exceptionally brave. After Sheriffmuir, the Jacobite army fell back north. When the rebellion finally collapsed, Glengarry submitted to the government commander at Inverness. Later, his followers surrendered their arms peacefully at Fort Augustus and received pardons for their part in the Rising. After these events, the Jacobite court in exile granted him a peerage title of its own, dated December 1716, recognizing him as a noble in their claimed kingdom. In his personal life, he married twice. His first wife was Anne, daughter of Hugh Lord Lovat, and they had a daughter named Anne, who married into the Applecross Mackenzie family. His second wife was Mary, daughter of Kenneth More Mackenzie, 3rd Earl of Seaforth, and by her he had sons, including John, who later succeeded him, Randolph, and others. The passage also repeats the story of Donald Gorm's heroic death at Killiecrankie, though that episode belongs to the earlier. John became the 12th chief of Glengarry, and on 27 August 1724, secured a legal grant that confirmed the lands of Knoydart to him and to his direct male descendants. Those lands had once belonged to the family through Aeneas, Lord MacDonald and Eros, but an earlier generation of the Duke of Argyll's house had removed Aeneas from Knoydart through the courts. With the new grant in place, Knoydart passed down first to John's son Alexander. When Alexander died without children, the property went to Duncan, a nephew in the wider family line. Duncan was the grandson of John and the closest male heir through Colonel Aeneas MacDonald, John's second son, who was killed in Falkirk while leading 2 clan battalions fighting for Prince Charles. Duncan himself stayed out of the Rising of 1745, but his second son, Angus, only 19, took the field for the prince and brought 2 battalions of Glengarry men with him. Those units were led by officers from Lochgarry and Barrisdale, both serving under Angus's overall authority. At the same time, Angus's elder brother Alistair was chosen by several Highland leaders for a symbolic mission to France, carrying a pledge of loyalty meant for the prince. He failed to meet Charles because the prince had already sailed to Scotland, and Alistair was captured and held in the Tower of London until after Culloden, even though he held a commission in French service. During the campaign, the Glengarry men became known for disciplined service and hard fighting. They helped seize a government captain and his detachment near the head of Loch Lochy, an early success that boosted morale. Newspapers later reported that the Glengarry battalion made an impressive showing when the prince reviewed them at Musselburgh, and that roughly 300 of them were with the Jacobite army. On the retreat from England, Glengarry men formed part of the rear guard and earned praise for protecting the withdrawal. At Clifton they met and scattered a strong force of English dragoons with bold, close fighting. At Falkirk they stood in the first line alongside Clanranald and Keppoch and fought with the steady aggression expected from veteran Highland troops. Culloden brought a different kind of story, one shaped by pride as much as tactics. The Glengarry MacDonalds were placed on the left, and many MacDonalds believed this was a public slight and a bad omen because their tradition held that they should stand on the right, an honor they said had been granted to them long ago. Accounts in this passage claim that this resentment damaged their willingness to attack. Some reports say they fired and edged forward, but did not launch the full charge that the battle demanded, and that they finally withdrew only when other clans began to break. Other writers later argued the whole dispute was exaggerated, pointing out that MacDonalds had fought effectively on the left before, including at Killiecrankie, and that the real disaster at Culloden came from many failures at once, not from one clan alone. Either way, this moment became a lasting controversy, with later commentators blaming wounded pride for turning a difficult battle into a collapse. After the defeat, Prince Charles spent a night in Glengarry's castle, which by then was nearly empty and unprepared for anyone, let alone a fugitive prince. Soon afterward, government troops under Cumberland devastated the area. The family house, like many Highland homes, was looted and burned, and the passage describes brutal treatment of civilians, including women and children, and the shooting of unarmed people in fields and on hillsides. John, the 12th chief, married twice. From his first marriage to a daughter of Colin Mackenzie of Hilton, he had Alistair, his main heir, and Aeneas, who became a colonel and acted as a leading war figure for the clan during the Rising. Aeneas married Mary MacDonald, a daughter of Alexander Robertson of Strowan. Their children included Duncan, who would later become chief, and a daughter Angusia, who married into the Mackay family. The account also includes a tragic incident linked to Colonel Aeneas at Falkirk. It says he was not killed by enemy fire in the fighting, but by an accidental shot in the town when a musket was discharged, while a soldier tried to clear it. The story claims Aeneas died shortly after, asking with his last words that the innocent man responsible should be spared. But clan anger demanded vengeance. To prevent a dangerous feud between regiments, the man was executed on the spot, and the passage even says the soldier's own father fired a shot to make his death quicker. From John's second marriage, to a daughter of John Gordon of Glenbucket, he had more children. James served as an army captain and had a daughter who later married into another MacDonald line. Charles joined a Highland regiment in 1757, fought in North America, rose in rank, was wounded near Quebec in 1759, and was later killed in 1762 at St. John's in Newfoundland. There is no clear record here of any children from him. John also had a daughter, Helen, who married into the Scotus branch. After John, the chiefship passed to Alistair, the 13th of Glengarry. Even while his father was still alive but elderly, Alistair was selected by Highland leaders for a dramatic pledge of loyalty intended for Prince Charles, said to have been signed in blood. On his return journey, he was intercepted by English warships, fought a losing action, and was taken prisoner. Because the government regarded the family as fiercely committed to the Stuart cause, and saw Alistair as influential among the Highlanders, he was held in the Tower of London until the crisis of the Rising had passed. He never married and died in 1761. The next chief was Duncan, the 14th of Glengarry, the only son of the colonel who died at Falkirk. Duncan married Marjorie, daughter of Sir Ludovic Grant of Dalby. Their children included Alistair Ranaldson, the heir, and James, who later became a highly decorated British general. James is remembered in this passage for major campaigns and for a famous moment of close fighting at Hougoumont, where he fought off enemy grenadiers who had broken into the courtyard. Several other sons died young or without families, and the daughters married into Chisholm, Ramsay, Downing, and other families, spreading the bloodline into different houses. In 1788, once Duncan was fully in legal control of the remaining estates, he created a new inheritance plan naming specific heirs, with his eldest son clearly placed first. Alistair Ranaldson then became the 15th of Glengarry, and is portrayed here as the last chief to live like an old-style Highland lord. He insisted on Highland dress, traveled with a personal following of retainers in full costume, and kept a kind of ceremonial guard at his door. This group became known locally as Glengarry's Tale. He appeared at the celebrations for George IV's visit to Edinburgh in 1822, with a small but carefully chosen escort of leading men from Glengarry-connected families. Reports from the time describe the followers as tough-looking Highlanders carrying traditional weapons and long guns, men who seemed born for forests and hunting. His devotion to old customs came at a heavy price. The passage suggests that his lifestyle and display drained the estate so badly that later it could not be held in the family. It even tells a local prophecy story, where a tenant known for making predictions claimed that once a new road was built around a certain hill, the MacDonalds of Glengarry would vanish from their ancestral lands. The chief confronted the man with threats, but the old soldier stood his ground, and the chief backed off. Not long after, the road was built, and soon after that, the estate passed out of the family, which people later treated as the prophecy coming true. The same section shows a more reflective side to him late in life. In a private talk with a close friend, he admitted he had been reckless, believing he was protecting ancestral honor while actually burning through the inheritance. He said he meant to change course and go south to put his affairs in order, but fate cut that plan short. In January 1828, he died trying to reach shore after a steamer wreck near Fort William. He was followed by his only surviving son, Aeneas Ranaldson, the 16th of Glengarry, born in 1818. He married Josephine Bennet and had children including Alistair Ranaldson, his heir, and Aeneas Robert, a brilliant student who drowned young in 1855. Another son, Charles Ranaldson, later became the family's main male representative after the death of the elder brother. Daughters married into other families, and one branch retained a small remnant of heritage connected to the old castle site and burial ground. By this time, the estate itself was in deep financial trouble. Aeneas Ranaldson emigrated with his family to Australia and sold most of the remaining property, which had been heavily mortgaged. The land passed through major owners for large sums, and eventually only tiny symbolic pieces remained linked to the Glengarry line, essentially the ruined castle site and the burial ground. After Aeneas Ranaldson, the family representation passed to Alistair Ranaldson, the 17th of Glengarry, who died unmarried in 1862, and then to his brother Charles Ranaldson, the 18th, who married but had no children. Charles died in 1868 while traveling home from New Zealand. In this telling, that death likely ended the direct male line descending from Alistair Dubh, unless an untraced American branch from a much earlier Major Charles MacDonald can be proven to have continued. Because of that uncertainty, some relatives refused to accept a new chief from the Scotus branch without stronger proof. Under the Scotus claim, however, the family representation shifted to a distant cousin from that line after Charles's death in June 1868, and this claim was accepted by the Scottish Heraldic Authority responsible for recognizing such successions. Aeneas Ranald, the 7th of Scotus and the 19th chief of Glengarry, died on the 24th of October of that same year. His eldest son, Aeneas Ranald, had already died before him, so the leadership passed to his grandson, Aeneas Ranald Westrop MacDonald. Born on the 5th of December 1847, he became the 20th representative and was regarded at the time as the acting chief of Glengarry. In 1874, he married Catherine Francis, the only daughter of Henry Harry's Creed, and they had 3 children: Aeneas Ranald, born 8th August 1875, Alistair Somerled, and Marion Lindsay. When the direct male line of Glengarry that descended from Ranald, the eldest son of Donald I of Scotus, came to an end, the succession was said to return to the descendants of Aeneas, also called Angus, who was the second son of Ranald II of Scotus. In earlier generations, when Ranald rose to Glengarry, he had arranged that the barony of Scotus would go to his own second son, Aeneas or Angus, and it was from this branch that the claim to represent Glengarry was later revived in 1868, after the last male representatives from the line of Alistair Dubh died out. Aeneas or Angus married a daughter of Sir Norman MacLeod. Their children included Donald, who became the main heir, John, who founded a Greenfield branch later represented in Canada, Alan, whose descendants went to America, and Alexander, whose line also settled overseas. Donald, who followed as Laird of Scotus, married 3 times. His first wife was Helen Meldrum, and they had a daughter, Margaret, who married into the Glen Calladale MacDonalds. His second wife was Elizabeth Cumming, and their son, Ranald, became the heir. His third wife was Mary Cameron of Glen Nevis, and they had a son, Archibald, who entered the church. Donald was killed at Culloden, and the Scotus succession moved to his only son, Ranald. Ranald first married Helen Grant of Glenmoriston and had a son, Aeneas, the heir. He later married Helen MacDonald, a daughter of John, the 12th of Glengarry, and had more children. Charles became a major and left 1 daughter. Donald served as a colonel in the East India Company's forces and married Anne MacDonald of Lochshiel, with children that included Aeneas Ronald, a lawyer associated with Morar, and several other sons and daughters. Ranald also had a son, John, who was killed in battle and never married, and he had 6 daughters as well. During Ranald's lifetime, he arranged that Scotus would pass to his son Aeneas and to Aeneas's heirs, while keeping for himself a modest lifetime income from the property. He lived into old age, and letters from the early 19th century describe him as a very elderly man by that point. Aeneas of Scotus married Anna Fraser of Culbachy, a woman widely praised for her beauty and talent. Their children included Aeneas Ranald, the heir Angus, who joined the army and died young, and Helen Grant, who was born after her father's death and later married Colonel Kyle of Binghill. Aeneas died at a place then known as Bowley Side in December 1792, and contemporary correspondence describes a large funeral attended by both gentry and common people, with formal hospitality provided afterward. Aeneas Ranald, who followed, entered the Madras civil service and later settled in Cheltenham. By then, the Scotus lands were burdened by heavy debts. His trustees tried to make the estate pay by clearing long-established tenants from the glens and raising rents through new arrangements, but even that did not solve the financial pressure. Eventually, Scotus was sold early in the century, first to Glenmoriston, and then, not long after, it was resold to Glengarry and merged into the wider Glengarry estate. Aeneas Ranald married Juliana Charlotte Wade, the daughter of an archdeacon connected with Bombay. Their children included Aeneas Ranald, who married Emma, the daughter of General Briggs, and their eldest son later became the recognized chief of Glengarry under this line. Other children included John Bird, who served as a lieutenant and adjutant, and daughters who married into professional families. Aeneas Ranald later married again and had another son named Angus. Another son, William, became a senior judge in Calcutta and had a large family. Other children included Thomas Monroe, Alexander Kyle, and daughters who married into the Lindsay and Bird families. After Charles Ranaldson MacDonald died on 28 June 1868, as the last male of the Glengarry line, descending from Alistair Dube, the Cheltenham branch, represented by Aeneas Ranald MacDonald, was presented as the successor and chief of the ancient house of Glengarry. Alongside this, the text turns to the Clanranald branch and explains why some writers praised its military reputation while disputing its claim to be the leading line of the wider Clandonald. One argument presented is that legal succession to certain lands implies that the Glengarry branch descended from an elder son, while the Moidart line must have come from a younger son. The central dispute is simple: whether Alan, the ancestor of Clanranald, was the first son of Ranald of the Isles or the second. The Clanranald tradition insists he was the elder, while other authorities argue the opposite. From this point, the narrative follows the early Moidart leaders. Alan MacDonald, also known as MacRanald, held Moidart and other western territories. He fought at Harlaw in 1411 and was later succeeded by his son, Roderick, remembered in Gaelic tradition as Rory Mac Alain. Roderick supported the Earl of Ross against royal power, took part in raids and battles in the Highlands, and led expeditions into the north where the fighting was fierce and losses were heavy. He married into the Donald Balloch line and strengthened alliances through marriages that connected Clanranald to Kintail, Gairloch, and other important houses. Roderick's son Alan, often called Alan MacRory, became a major figure in late 15th century island politics. He backed factions in the struggle around the Lordship of the Isles, joined raiding expeditions into Ross and Cromarty, and was repeatedly pulled into government efforts to impose order. At times, he and other chiefs gave formal pledges to keep the peace, yet feuds continued, especially over contested lands such as Garmaran and Uist. A dramatic episode describes how Alan was briefly displaced by his own brother. Instead of seeking help from his usual allies, Alan went directly to his old enemy, Mackenzie of Kintail, and offered friendship in return for support. Kintail accepted, marched with force, and restored Alan to control. The opposing side complained to the king, but Alan stepped forward and argued that he himself should bear responsibility rather than let his new ally be punished. The king was reportedly impressed and confirmed Alan in his lands. Later disputes over legal titles and royal charters appear again and again in the story, but the heart of this section is the rise of John Moidertach. John was born outside formal marriage, yet was regarded as exceptionally capable in both war and negotiation. When his father died, the clan chose John as captain and leader, even though there were men with stronger legal claims. John secured royal recognition at times, lost it at others, was arrested and imprisoned during a royal voyage through the Isles, and then returned to the Highlands to reclaim power with broad clan support. The struggle reached a climax in the Battle of Blarleen on the 15th of July, 1544. The opposing force included Fraser leadership and the rival claimant Ranald Galda, backed by powerful allies. John Moidartak and his supporters tracked their movements, chose terrain carefully, and struck when the enemy could not easily avoid battle. The fighting was brutal and lasted for hours in intense heat. Tradition says men stripped down to shirts and kilts for ease, which is why the battle name is linked to shirts. After arrows were spent, the fight turned into close combat with swords. Losses were catastrophic among the leading men on both sides, and the battle ended with Fraser leaders and Ranald Galda among the dead, leaving John Moidartak in control of Moidart and the Clanranald leadership in practice. A famous tradition adds a grim detail. Before the battle, the Moidart men left their walking staves by a small loch, so that afterward, the number left unclaimed would show how many would not return. Another tale describes a father and son fighting near the rival leader, the son stepping forward to replace his wounded father, and using a moment of deception to bring down a superior swordsman. The same tradition claims that Ranald Galda survived the battlefield badly wounded, was recognized during the night, and was then killed through treachery while under care. Whether every detail of that story is accurate or not, the narrative uses it to underline how bitter the conflict became, even within the same extended kindred. It also adds that, despite the scale of the Fraser losses, many widows later gave birth to sons, which later writers treated as an extraordinary twist of fate that helped the clan recover. Another tradition tells the story of the battle in a different way. Some details change, and this version is often repeated in oral accounts. Even so, there is hesitation about accepting the role it gives to John of Moidart in the final moments of Ranald Galda. The story begins by recalling the long chain of events that led both clans to the battlefield. Among the MacDonalds, there was an old warrior, strong and experienced, who had 7 grown sons from his first marriage and one much younger son from a second wife. The father was known as a powerful swordsman, and his older sons were just as skilled and fearless as he was. As the MacDonald force advanced quickly toward the battlefield, some fell behind. When the warriors gathered on the hill above North Lagan before descending, the old man saw that all his sons were with him, including the youngest, whom he deeply loved. Fearing for the boy's life, the father tried repeatedly to persuade him to turn back. He reminded him of his mother and the danger ahead, but nothing worked. In desperation, the father finally used harsh words, mocking him as a beardless youth who belonged at home rather than in battle. The young man said nothing. He followed his father silently and stepped onto the battlefield beside him. When Lord Lovat emerged from the woods of Letterfinlay onto the wide plain near Loch Lochy, he saw the MacDonalds already drawn up in formation. Their right flank rested near the loch, and their left near marshy ground, cutting off his path back to his own lands. One of Lovat's elders urged him to avoid battle and retreat through the hills toward Glen Roy. Lovat refused. Pride and honor would not allow him to leave without fighting. The day was extremely hot. Seeing that the MacDonalds had stripped down to shirts, as was their custom when fighting at home, Lovat ordered his own men to do the same. Because of this, the battle became known as Blarleen, the Field of Shirts. The fighting took place in a confined area bordered by the loch, marshland, and surrounding hills. Much of this ground is now covered by water and the canal, but small hillocks nearby are still remembered as places where wounded men crawled to die. Their names reflect pain and suffering, fitting reminders of the slaughter that occurred there. Ranald Galda entered the battle determined to confront his uncle and reclaim what he believed was taken from him: leadership, honor, and inheritance. Young, strong, and highly skilled with the sword, he pushed deep into the MacDonald ranks, seeking a personal duel. John of Moidart, however, avoided direct confrontation. Surrounded by his close guard, he moved across the field, restoring order among his men and striking down enemies where needed. Although John's guard advanced successfully, they paid a heavy price. Ranald Galda and Lord Lovat fought with relentless force, cutting down MacDonald warriors one after another. Among the MacDonalds stood the old warrior, forced to guard the wounded body of John of Moidart, who had been struck down and carried from the field. One by one, the old man saw his sons fall. Only he remained. When John had been taken away, the old warrior turned his full fury on Ranald Galda. At first he attacked directly, but soon realized that Ranald's speed and technique gave him the advantage. The old man changed tactics, stepping back slowly while defending himself, drawing Ranald closer to the MacDonald side of the field. At that moment, the old man's youngest son appeared, searching desperately for his father. Seeing the retreat, and remembering the insult from earlier that day, the youth shouted that he hated to see an old man stepping backward in battle. Without hesitation, he rushed between his father and Ranald Galda, calling for a fair and equal fight. The father immediately saw that his son, though brave, could not match Ranald's strength and skill. Fear and rage overwhelmed him. In a moment of deception, he shouted a warning to Ranald, claiming enemies were behind him. Ranald instinctively turned. In that instant, the old warrior struck him down with a fatal blow and cried out in triumph. With Ranald Galda and Lord Lovat fallen, and few Frasers left standing, the survivors tried to retreat. The MacDonalds, driven by grief and rage over the loss of their kin, regrouped and launched one final assault. The Frasers broke and fled through the Great Glen. The MacDonalds pursued them for many miles, killing all they could catch. Ranald Galda was carried from the field still alive and placed in a hut near one of the hillocks. A strange figure, serving both as healer and prophet to the clan, examined his wound and reported to John of Moidart that Ranald might survive, but only barely. He claimed even a small pin could end his life. John silently handed him a pin from his cloak. Inside the hut, the healer tried to disarm Ranald, but the wounded man resisted. The old warrior demanded that the wound be treated without removing the dagger. The healer replied that he would try, though hope was slim. As the old man and his son stepped back, the healer leaned in. Ranald suddenly moved, and in a final act of strength, drove his dagger into the healer's heart. With that act of revenge, Ranald Galda died. After the battle, conflict continued for years. John of Moidart faced constant pressure from neighboring clans and powerful nobles. Raids and counter-raids followed. Attempts were made by royal forces to subdue him, but his strength and the loyalty of his people repeatedly frustrated these efforts. Eventually, John was persuaded to submit temporarily to royal authority, only to escape again. Later, he reconciled with the crown and lived more peacefully. In his later years, he ruled quietly among his people, respected as one of the most capable leaders the MacDonalds ever produced. Alan, the 8th chief of Moidart and Clanranald, stepped into leadership after a lifetime spent close to his father's turbulent rise. By the time his father died, Alan was already close to 50, and his name had appeared earlier among those covered by royal remissions granted to the family. Yet his own rule soon became overshadowed by bloodshed, because in 1588 he fell into a violent quarrel with Alexander MacDonald of Kippock and killed Alexander's brother. The consequence was serious. Official papers were issued treating Alan and his son as rebels for the killing and for refusing to submit themselves to the law. No clear record suggests that Alan ever received a full pardon for that act, and he also seems not to have obtained fresh crown charters confirming his possession of the lands inherited from his father. Even so, he appears to have held those territories without being driven out during his lifetime. Alan married a woman from the MacLeod family of Harris, a widow who had already been connected to the Sleat line through her earlier marriage. The marriage did not bring peace. Alan's harsh treatment of his wife provoked a bitter feud between Clanranald and the MacLeods, a quarrel that burned for years and spilled into wider violence. The hostility only cooled much later when a new marriage linked the two families again and turned old enemies into relatives by blood. From this marriage, Alan had several children. His eldest son, Angus, died before him and left no descendants. Donald then became the next chief. Another son, Ranald, received large holdings in Benbecula and Arasaig, and in later generations it was through Ranald's line that the succession continued when the main male branch failed. A son named John secured rights in the lands of Kinlochmoidart, and later family lines traced descent from him through the maternal side. Alan's daughters were married into powerful neighboring houses, strengthening alliances through kinship. Alan died in 1593, and he was followed by Donald, the 9th chief of Clanranald. Donald entered the storm of island warfare through marriage into the MacDonald house of Isla, which at that time was locked in conflict with Lachlan Moore MacLean of Duart. Clanranald joined his wife's family, invaded MacLean territory in Mull, Tiree, and Coll, and carried out a destructive raid, burning settlements and driving off spoils. MacLean could not answer immediately, but the moment for revenge arrived soon after. In the summer of 1595, the MacDonalds prepared a major voyage to Ireland to assist Red Hugh O'Neill in his struggle against Elizabeth's forces. A large fleet sailed, and most of it passed without challenge. But a smaller body of men under Clanranald's command halted on Mull for the night, believing themselves safe in a sheltered harbor. MacLean struck with a sudden night attack, captured the whole party, chained the leading men, and scattered them among his castles. The vessels were seized, and the ordinary soldiers were carried off to the mainland. The exploit was widely celebrated by MacLean's allies, and Elizabeth's government was pleased by any blow that weakened the MacDonald power at sea. Donald later fought alongside the MacDonalds of Glengarry against the Mackenzies in Kintail and the neighboring districts. After marching back through Skye to his own lands in Uist, he found that Murdoch MacNeill of Beara was raiding South Uist under the claim that part of the island belonged to him. Clanranald met him at North Boisdale, where many of the Barra men were killed. MacNeill escaped, but Donald pursued him to Beara and forced him to flee farther west into more remote islands. Like many chiefs of his era, Donald became heavily burdened with debts, partly to the crown and partly to neighbors, as penalties for raids, reprisals, and damage done by men who acted in his name. In 1608, he was among the Western leaders who met royal commissioners at Aros Castle in Mull and accepted harsh terms meant to break the old warlike system. The chiefs agreed to give security for paying rents, surrender certain strongholds, submit to the laws of the realm, and give up sea power by handing over their galleys and war vessels for destruction. They were also pressed to send children south to be raised and educated under supervision so that the next generation would be shaped by royal authority rather than island warfare. In 1610, Donald received a temporary suspension of his debts for 3 years on the grounds that he had been forced to answer for the long-running crimes of kinsmen and dependents and could not possibly pay the great sums laid against him. During these same years, arrangements were made over lands in Benbecula and neighboring districts through charters granted and confirmed, and Donald strengthened his position by gathering his scattered rights into a more coherent estate centered on Castle Tirham, which was treated as the principal seat of his barony. Yet old rival claims did not disappear. A line descended from Ranald Galda still argued that the lands of Moidart and Arasaig belonged to them by earlier right. They had held them for a time, and Donald eventually drove them out and took possession by force. The dispossessed claimant took the matter to legal action, but Donald treated it with contempt and refused to recognize the court's authority. Decrees were issued against him, and he was declared a rebel on paper. Yet he continued to hold the lands in practice. The dispute faded only when the claimants died soon after, removing the immediate pressure, even though the tension had never been truly settled by consent. Despite repeated accusations of violence and depredation, Donald gradually reached a full reconciliation with the king. In 1613, he received a broad remission for past offenses. Even after this, royal policy tightened around the Western chiefs. He was subjected to strict rules. He had to appear regularly before the council when summoned, limit the number of gentlemen in his household, remain within prescribed bounds, encourage farming and planting on his lands, restrict luxury and supplies, reduce the number of war vessels, and limit weapons. For the enforcement of these conditions, he had to provide bonds and guarantees from trusted associates. Later family tradition says that he was knighted at Holyrood in 1617. He died in December 1619 and was succeeded by his eldest son, John. John, the 10th chief of Clan Ranald, moved quickly to secure alliances. In the early 1620s, he made a formal bond of loyalty with Glengarry, binding both sides, their servants, and their tenants to stand together against deadly enemies. He also entered agreements over superiorities and FU rights, reshaping the legal framework of his lands so that his possession rested on firmer titles. In time, he was formally served heir to his father in Eigg, and in the barony created earlier around Castle Tirham, and later he was recognized more generally as heir to earlier ancestors in the line. These legal arrangements had a cost. As titles were made up and reissued through higher hands, powerful families gained influence over the superiorities. The Argyll interest in particular expanded, and other great houses also appear in the background as superior rights shifted and overlapped. Clan Ranald still held the estate, but layers of authority were placed above it, changing the old independence of the chief into a position more tightly enclosed by the crown and by major noble families. When civil war erupted across Scotland, John became an active participant in the royalist campaigns led by Montrose. In 1645, he joined Montrose and Alexander MacDonald at Inverlochie and fought through the victories of that season. Later, he returned home to raise more men and found that Mingari had been threatened by Argyll. He moved swiftly to relieve it, defeated Argyll's force, reinforced the garrison, and retaliated by devastating wide areas of neighboring lands. Back at Castle Tirham, he met Alexander MacDonald, who praised the resolution of John's eldest son, Donald, and gave the young man a command. From there, the royalist force gathered strength as other chiefs joined, men from Glengarry, Keppoch, Appin, Glencoe, Glen Nevis, and large bodies of Camerons. At Blair Athol, a council decided winter movement. Montrose preferred a descent into the lowlands, but the Highland leaders wanted to strike Argyll's country in revenge, and the army marched in that direction. Argyll, believing his passes could not be forced in winter, was stunned when news arrived that Montrose and the Highlanders were near Inverary in December. Argyll fled by sea. Inverary was burned, and the land was swept in 3 divisions under Montrose, Alexander MacDonald, and Clanranald. Contemporary accounts describe the march as ruthless, with widespread burning, killing of armed men, and driving off of cattle and goods, carried out as retaliation for earlier devastations inflicted by Argyll's side. Clanranald's men later reappeared in the great battles of 1645, fighting with distinction at Inverlochie, at Aldern, and at Kilsyth. John returned from recruiting with substantial reinforcements and was accompanied by his young son Donald, who repeatedly distinguished himself. A sharp moment arose when Montrose complained that Clanranald had brought men without providing food, and John answered that his men could always supply themselves. Alexander MacDonald calmed the tension and promised that Clanranald's party would soon bring in more provisions than any other. Young Donald led a foray that returned with enormous booty, enough to sustain the army for a long time, and Montrose apologized for his earlier remark. As the campaign continued, many Highlanders drifted home with plunder, and the leadership asked leave to return to repair burned houses and prepare winter supplies. They promised to come back within 40 days in greater strength. Montrose, unable to hold volunteers by force, dismissed them with praise. Yet the promised return did not truly happen, and Montrose's fortunes soon weakened after losing the active field support of so many Highland troops. Even so, Clanranald's loyalty to the royal cause is repeatedly emphasized in later accounts, which portray the chief as steadfast in defeat as in victory. In 1650, after Charles II landed in the north, John went to pay his respects and then withdrew to his island lands in Uist, where he spent the rest of his life. He married Moir, also known as Marion, a daughter of the MacLeod chief remembered as Rory More, and this marriage helped end an older feud between Clanranald and the MacLeods. By her, he had a son, Donald, as heir and several daughters who married into neighboring ruling families. John died in 1670 at a very advanced age in the island of Eriska, near South Uist, and was buried at Tomar, after which his son succeeded him as chief. Donald of Clanranald was already well known to his contemporaries, even before becoming chief. During his father's lifetime, he played a visible and respected role in the campaigns led by Montrose, earning recognition among the Highland leaders of his generation. His early military experience shaped both his reputation and his later decisions. After the crushing defeat at the Battle of Philiphaugh, Montrose withdrew north. Soon after, the Earl of Antrim landed in Kintyre and met with him. Several clans, including Clanranald, agreed to support the cause, but the king's sudden order to disband the army brought all immediate plans to an end. At this point, Donald was instructed by his father to travel to Islay and remove the Campbells from the island. At the same time, the Earl of Antrim invited Donald to join the royal forces fighting for King Charles in Ireland. Accepting this call, Donald gathered 300 men and sailed from Uist in 1648. He passed through the Sound of Mull, stopped at Colonsay, and then entered the Sound of Islay, where his force captured a large vessel belonging to the Scottish estates, loaded with barley. From there, they crossed to Ireland. Donald and his men were quartered at Kilkenny, where they joined Glengarry and a substantial force of Highland soldiers. Together, they took part in several major operations, including the capture of Belfast, Knockfergus, Coleraine, and Londonderry. Throughout these actions, Donald of Clanranald held a senior position within the Highland Regiment and distinguished himself through courage and leadership. He remained with the Royal Army until its final collapse. After the defeat, both Clanranald and Glengarry were captured and imprisoned at Kilkenny, where they were held for a long period. Their release was eventually secured through the influence of the Duchess of Buckingham, who later married the Earl of Antrim. Once freed, they returned to the Highlands, and Clanranald safely landed again in Uist. Following his father's death, Donald formally secured his legal rights to the family estates. However, his involvement in years of warfare had left him heavily in debt. To raise funds, he was forced to grant Moidart and Arisaig as security to Sir James MacDonald for 4,000 merks. These lands were later redeemed. In 1674, he formally resigned and received confirmation of several key territories, including Arisaig, Moidart, Benbecula, and the island of Aig. A decade later, he obtained official possession of the island of Canna and openly styled himself as Captain and Chief of Clanranald. Donald married his cousin Marion, daughter of John MacLeod of MacLeod. She was sister to several successive chiefs of that house. Together they had several children. John died in infancy. Alan later became chief, followed by his brother Ranald. Margaret married Donald MacDonald of Benbecula, who would later become head of the clan. 2 other daughters died without heirs. Donald passed away in 1686 on the island of Canna and was buried at Tomar. He was succeeded by his second son, Alan, who became 12th of Clanranald, while still only about 16 years old. Because of his youth, Alan was placed under the guardianship of his brother-in-law, Donald MacDonald of Benbecula. This guardian took great care in shaping the young chief's education and political outlook. The family's long loyalty to the Stuarts, combined with Benbecula's personal influence, strongly reinforced Alan's attachment to the Stuart cause. In 1689, both Tutor and Ward joined Viscount Dundee at Inverness and offered their service. After raising their followers, they marched south and took part in the famous campaign that culminated in the Battle of Killiecrankie. Clanranald's regiment played a leading role in the fighting, advancing with devastating effect. Although the Highland victory was complete, Dundee himself was killed in the moment of triumph. After the battle, the government offered protection to all rebels who would surrender by early 1692. Clanranald rejected this offer and traveled to France with his brother Ranald. There, he completed his education under the protection of James VII and became known as one of the most accomplished gentlemen of his age. While in France, Clanranald entered military service under the Duke of Berwick and quickly earned a strong reputation as a brave and capable officer. After peace was restored, he returned to the Stuart court in exile and learned that his estates had been preserved through the careful efforts of his guardian and friends in Scotland. During his time abroad, Clanranald met Penelope, daughter of Colonel Mackenzie, former governor of Tangier. Celebrated for her intelligence and character as much as her beauty, she chose Clanranald over many other suitors. Confident that happiness depended on character rather than comfort, she agreed to marry him and follow him to the Highlands. They returned to South Uist, where their household soon became famous for hospitality and refinement. Despite the remoteness of the region, visitors from across the country were drawn to their home, which came to resemble a small but lively court worthy of a Highland chief. In 1704, Clanranald formally secured possession of his estates, and by 1706 he was fully invested in them. It was widely believed that he maintained contact with the Stuart court before the Rising of 1715. When the Earl of Mar raised his standard, Clanranald immediately sailed from Uist and summoned his followers. Refusing to submit to government demands, he openly declared for the Chevalier and was appointed colonel in the Jacobite army. He led operations in Argyllshire, disrupting government supporters and preventing local clans from joining royal forces. His campaign tied down large numbers of Campbells and greatly assisted Mar's overall strategy. In November 1715, Clanranald joined the main Jacobite army at Perth. Soon after, the army marched toward Dunblane, leading to the Battle of Sheriff Moor. There, Clanranald fought with exceptional bravery, but was mortally wounded. His death was mourned by both friend and foe alike, and even hostile writers praised his character, courage, and generosity. He was buried near Perth, and leadership passed to his brother Ranald, who was then living in France. Before Ranald could return home, the rebellion collapsed, and he was named among those attainted. Through the intervention of loyal friends, steps were taken to preserve the clan estates. But Ranald died in exile in 1725, before these efforts could be completed. With his death, the direct male line ended, and succession passed to the nearest male heir, Donald MacDonald of Benbecula, who became 14th of Clanranald. His leadership ensured the survival of the family's lands and status during a period of great danger. The next generation would again be drawn into history during the Rising of 1745. Ranald MacDonald, 15th of Clanranald, personally refused to join the rebellion, but allowed his son to act according to his conscience. When Prince Charles arrived in the Hebrides, it was young Clanranald who finally pledged support, becoming one of the earliest and most devoted chiefs to join the cause. He fought throughout the campaign, from the early victories to the final defeat at Culloden, where he was wounded but escaped capture. After months in hiding, he eventually fled abroad, serving with distinction in the French army under Marshal Saxe. Through a clerical error in the Act of Attainder, his name was recorded incorrectly. This mistake later allowed him to recover his estates and return home. In later life, he lived quietly as a loyal subject of the crown. Of all those who followed Prince Charles, none acted with purer loyalty or greater sacrifice than Clanranald. He refused payment, maintained his men at his own expense, and served without hope of reward. It was widely believed that, had fortune turned differently, he would have been raised to the rank of Earl in recognition of his unwavering devotion. All of the arrangements mentioned earlier were settled while the older chief was still alive. By the time the last Jacobite troubles had faded, he was already an elderly man, and his strength continued to decline. On 28 November 1753, no longer able to manage estate affairs, he gave up his life interest in the lands and handed control to his son, Ranald. Ranald moved quickly and efficiently, and under his steady management, the estate's debts were soon cleared. For the remainder of his life, Ranald kept a low profile. He lived quietly on his own land, avoiding unnecessary display and focusing on peace after years of strain and uncertainty. Ranald married twice. His first wife was Mary, the daughter of Basil Hamilton, who later became Earl of Selkirk and was connected to the wider Hamilton family. Mary was born on the 8th of May, 1720, and died on the 11th of May, 1750. They had one child, Charles James Somerled, who died at the age of 5 in Edinburgh on 25th May, 1755, and was laid to rest at Holyrood. After Mary's death, Ranald married Flora, the daughter of Mackinnon, remembered in her time for her beauty. This marriage produced several children. John became the heir. James later rose to the rank of lieutenant colonel in the army. Margaret and Mary both remained unmarried. Penelope married William, 7th Lord Belhaven, and Stenton, who died on 29th October 1814. They had sons named Robert Montgomery, born in 1793, and later the 8th peer, and William, born in 1799, who entered the East India Company's service, along with 4 daughters named Penelope, Susan Mary, Flora, and Jean. Penelope, Lady Belhaven, died in 1816. After Ranald's death, the leadership passed to his eldest surviving son, John MacDonald, who became 17th of Clanranald. He was still very young when he inherited. He spent several years traveling across Europe with a well-educated tutor and received a broad and polished upbringing. On returning, he obtained a military commission and became a captain in the 22nd Dragoons. Not long after settling his legal claim to the estates, he left the army and chose to live mainly among his own people, where he was respected by his retainers. He died in 1794, only 29 years old, and his death was deeply felt. John married twice. His first wife was Catherine, daughter of Robert McQueen of Braxfield, a senior Scottish judge. They had 3 sons: Reginald George, born in Edinburgh on the 29th of August, 1788, who became the heir, Robert Johnstone, and Donald. His second marriage was to his second cousin Jean, daughter of Colin MacDonald of Boisdale and granddaughter of Alexander, the first of that line. This marriage produced no children. When John died in 1794, he was succeeded by Reginald George MacDonald, who became 18th of Clanranald. Reginald George was born on the 29th of August, 1788, and inherited the estate when he was only 6 years old. His early education began in Edinburgh, and later he was sent to Eton. After that, he spent several years abroad on the European continent before returning home. When he reached adulthood in 1809, he quickly took on public responsibilities. He became commander of the Long Island Regiment, a local militia unit in Inverness Shire, and held this position for many years. He also served in Parliament as member for the burgh of Plympton from 1812 to 1824, a constituency that later lost its status after the Reform Act of 1832. He lived to an advanced age. Not long before his death, he returned to the Highlands and impressed friends with his lively spirit and surprisingly youthful energy for his years. In the late 1830s, the estate's annual rental income was described as about £4,500, but not long afterwards this chief sold the property for a large sum to Colonel Gordon of Cluny in Aberdeenshire. On the 1st of April 1812, he married Lady Caroline Anne Edgecombe, the second daughter of Richard, 2nd Earl of Mount Edgecombe. She died on the 10th of April 1824. They had a son, Reginald John James George, who became his heir and was later known as Clanranald. They also had several daughters who made notable marriages into British and European families. Caroline Sophia married the Aunchure Charles Cust in 1842 and had a son and 3 daughters. Emma Hamilla married the Ontru and Rev. Alfred Wadhouse in 1840 and had several children. Louisa Emily married first Charles William Marsham and later Colonel Hugh Fitzroy of the Grenadier Guards. Flora served as a maid of honor to the Queen. Sarah Ann married Baron Porcelli, a Sicilian nobleman, and had children, including a later marriage linking the families again. After Lady Caroline's death, he married Anne Cunningham, widow of Richard Barry Dunning, Lord Ashburton, but no children came from the marriage. He later married Elizabeth Rebecca Newman, also without children. Reginald George died in London at his home in Clarendon Road on the 11th of March, 1873, aged 84. He was succeeded by his eldest son, Sir Reginald John James George, who became 19th Clanranald and was a Vice Admiral in the Royal Navy, as well as a holder of distinguished honors. Sir Reginald married Adelaide Louisa, daughter of George, 5th Lord Vernon, on 12th June 1855. They had children including Alan Douglas, born in April 1856, who became the heir. Angus Roderick, born in April 1858, later living in Calcutta, and a daughter named Adelaide Ephrata,